Cinnamon Bell grew up in a big, lively family. She was in fact one of 9 siblings. Her brother Luke remembered her as a kid who was always smiling. Every childhood photo, every early memory, pure light. As an adult, that spark never faded either. Even when life threw obstacle after obstacle in her path, Cinnamon fought for a better future. She wasn't just working to survive, she had dreams. She was raising 3 young children, and she was doing it almost single-handedly. Cinnamon had big plans too. She wanted to study medicine and to specialize in healthcare, and to help her immunocompromised daughter to live a full life. Limited resources never stopped her. Support wasn't always easy to find, but Cinnamon still made sure that her kids felt loved, safe, and hopeful about their future too. Friends described her as loyal, generous, and stubbornly optimistic, the kind of person who would give away her final dollar if someone else needed it more. But she didn't just want to survive any longer. She wanted to thrive for her children. And on her final night, she was already enrolled in a medical course, and she was just days away from starting. But all of that promise, all of that fight for more, would be put to an end before she could truly flourish. Cody James Edwards didn't have that same kind of glow around him. His past was marked by instability, by substance use, and a growing sense of paranoia. By the time he met Cinnamon Bell, Cody was already a heavy user of hallucinogens. He had a particular history with a substance called DOI, a substance which is often missold as that classic substance that hippies used to trip on in the 60s, and well, they probably do today as well. But this wasn't the kind of thing that made you giggly or mellow. Instead, it was notorious for triggering paranoia or even full-blown psychotic episodes. And Cody knew this. He'd used it before and he'd felt this before. But even knowing the risks, he continued using. When he and Cinnamon first got together, friends say that there was a hopeful period. It was brief, but it was real. Both of them were trying to move forward in their life. Both had baggage and both wanted better. But cracks started to show early on. There were arguments, there was growing tension, and there was substance use that only deepened Cody's volatility. The happy home that Cinnamon wanted to build was crumbling from the inside. And nobody, not even she herself, could have predicted just how it would all collapse. At first glance, Cinnamon and Cody might have seemed like an ordinary couple. Just 2 young people trying to rebuild. Behind closed doors, however, the cracks had started to form almost immediately. Friends later said that there were arguments, and sometimes these were even loud enough for neighbours to overhear. But it was nothing too extreme at first, nothing that immediately screamed danger. But those closest to Cinnamon noticed that she was withdrawing. There started to be missed phone calls. There were plans being cancelled at the last minute. There were moments where her bright spirit seemed dulled, as if she were carrying something too heavy to name. There were also concerns about Cody's substance use, and his reliance on hallucinogens, especially DOI, was now spiralling. The Cody that Cinnamon fell for wasn't always the man standing in front of her, not anymore. But still, she stayed. Maybe she hoped that he would change. Maybe she believed that love could still fix this situation. Or maybe she understood how quickly substance-fueled paranoia could turn into something catastrophic. March the 12th, 2022 started like any other night, but it would end with heartbreak so profound it would shatter an entire community. Cinnamon and Cody had both taken DOI that evening. And at some point, Cody slipped into what experts would later describe as a full-blown paranoia psychosis. In his mind, Cinnamon wasn't his partner anymore. Instead, she was an imagined threat. She was someone that he believed wanted to hurt him. And inside her modest Paul Street home, what began as an argument quickly spiraled out of control. Cody grabbed a metal dumbbell bar and he struck Cinnamon, not once, but over and over. The left side of her head was crushed under the force. She fell to the bedroom floor, likely unconscious. But it didn't stop there. Cody continued the beating. Cinnamon's time on this earth came to an end. But even though she was no longer breathing, Cody got a sharp implement and used it 5 times on Cinnamon's back, and then there was silence. Cody stumbled outside, disorientated. Neighbours would later recall a strange sight, a young man wandering aimlessly in the street, as if he was waking from a nightmare that he couldn't escape, and his behaviour was bizarre enough for onlookers to call the police. The officers who responded to Paul Street that night were wearing body cams. The footage shows them pulling up outside Cinnamon's house. They spot Cody first, sitting on the ground, blank-faced, with red on his clothes. Get on the floor, get on the ground. The officers' voices are sharp, cutting through the eerie silence. Cody doesn't run though, he doesn't argue. He lies down slowly and says, almost dreamlike,
"I'm surrendering."
Inside the house, officers move quickly, and then they stop. One officer can be heard swearing under his breath. The scene they found was worse than anything they had been prepared for. Meanwhile, Cody was loaded into the back of a police van and was taken to the Mount Gambier police station. There, a video-recorded interview captured what little coherence he had left. He sat slumped at a table, face pale, eyes glazed. When officers asked what he had taken, Cody mumbled, LSD. As the questions continued, the weight of what he'd done seemed to finally crash down on him. He buried his head in his arms. He banged his forehead against the table, groaning.
This is real, isn't it?
At that moment, any lingering haze of the substance-induced psychosis must have lifted, and now only the grim reality remained. Word of Cinnamon's end spread fast through Millicent, a tight-knit town where everyone knew everyone. This meant that the shock ran deep. Police cordoned off Paul Street for days, combing through the home for evidence. Major crime detectives and forensics teams were flown in from Adelaide.
Honestly, I'm just disgusted and heartbroken because I knew both of them, her children came first no matter what, and she loved them like no tomorrow.
Friends say he'd moved in with Cinnamon about a month ago. The house is now a murder scene.
Neighbours to the house were horrified. Many had seen Cinnamon just hours before her end, sitting on her front steps, chatting with a friend and laughing. But by morning, her home was a crime scene. Superintendent Campbell Hill described the community's reaction as shock and grief on a devastating scale. Millicent wasn't a place where things like this happened, and certainly not to someone like Cinnamon, a young mum just trying to build a better life. Her 3 children, aged 6, 4 and 3, had been staying with their grandmother on that night, and they were still small enough to believe that they were simply on a fun sleepover, and for a little while longer they could be shielded from the truth. But the damage had been done, and the ripples were only just beginning. When Cody Edwards first faced court, he pleaded not guilty to murder. The trial began in the Supreme Court, sitting in Mount Gambier, with a judge, not a jury, presiding. From the beginning, his defense team made their strategy clear. They argued that Cody had experienced a substance-fueled psychotic break, that he genuinely believed that Cinnamon was trying to harm him, and that, in that moment, he acted out of self-defense. The Crown, however, pushed back hard. They pointed to the sheer brutality of the attack. After all, there were over 50 injuries. There was blunt force trauma so severe it crushed the back of the skull, as well as the usage of the sharp implement after Cinnamon had already stopped moving. The Crown argued that this wasn't reasonable, proportional, or remotely excusable. Midway through the trial, Cody was rearraigned. He pleaded guilty to manslaughter, and the prosecution accepted the plea. The courtroom reaction was immediate. Members of Cinnamon's family, who had sat through every graphic detail of the case, walked out. Some left in tears, others shook their heads in disbelief. Outside the courthouse, her sister, Shenta Bell, called the plea deal a betrayal. It was all about him, she said bitterly. What about what she went through? Inside, the trial pivoted into sentencing submissions, and the outrage only grew louder. Victim impact statements were read aloud in court, and each word was sharp, raw, and impossible to ignore. Cinnamon's mother, Rosemary, spoke about the unimaginable task of caring for 3 grieving young kids. And I'll warn you, this really is heartbreaking. Children who still said, "I love you, mummy," every day, not fully understanding that their mother was never coming back. Her son, now 8, sometimes woke up sobbing because he couldn't remember the sound of his mother's voice. Her daughter, 6, refused to look in the mirror because the reflection reminded her too much of Cinnamon. The youngest, just 4, talked to her mother's photo after school every single day. They received a life sentence of loss and grief, Rosemary said, while the man who did this will walk free in a few years. How does that make sense? Cinnamon's sister Brenda also wrote to the court. She reminded Judge Kimber that this was not just a tragic accident or an unfortunate misunderstanding. Instead, it was a brutal event that left lifelong effects on many people. The courtroom was heavy with emotion. Even seasoned court staff struggled to keep composure. Cody sat through it all, silent. At one point, though, he read an apology letter out loud. He said that he would be haunted by what he'd done. But by then, most of Cinnamon's family had already walked out, unwilling to hear another word. When sentencing day arrived, emotions were raw. Justice Adam Kimber described Cody's attack on Cinnamon as brutal and devastating. He said that Cody's voluntary use of DOI, knowing its effects on him, made his moral culpability even higher. However, because of the accepted manslaughter plea, Cody's sentence now had limits that the court couldn't change. He was sentenced to just 11 years in prison, and he had a non-parole period of 8 years and 10 months. His time was backdated to his arrest on March 12, 2022, meaning that Cody could be eligible for release as early as January 2031. As the sentence was read out, supporters of Cinnamon's family stood up and stormed out of the court once more. Some shouted at Cody as he was led away. Outside, Cinnamon's sister, Shenta, called it a spit in her face. They made it all about him, she said. What about her? What about her kids? But something did change. Public outrage, led by Cinnamon's family and friends, sparked political action. South Australia's Attorney General, Kyan Mayer, announced that the government would introduce new laws that would prevent people from using substance-induced psychosis as a way to lessen their responsibility for their crimes. The laws as they currently stand do not meet community expectations, he said. Drafting of the law began almost immediately, and the movement that Cinnamon's family started may one day save others from facing the same injustice. The voice on the line was flat, almost rehearsed. It shared harrowing words with a 999 call handler, words that left police and paramedics rushing to the scene. Moments later, emergency responders entered a quiet home in Cedar Gardens, Brighton. Upstairs, the bathwater was tinged red. 69-year-old Sue Addis was floating in it. This whole thing started as a rescue plan. It started with love, but somehow something much darker took over. To understand how devastating this crime was to the city of Brighton, you first have to understand who Sue Addis was. She wasn't just a grandmother, she was the heart and soul of her community. She co-owned 2 of Brighton's most iconic Italian restaurants, Donatello and Pinocchio. Both were frequented by celebrities, footballers, tourists and locals alike. Former Prime Minister Tony Blair had eaten there, so had Katie Price, aka Jordan, and Bill Nighy too. But Sue's focus was never just the elite, it was really the everyday people. She ran her businesses with warmth and generosity, employing scores of young people over the decades, and often giving second chances to those who needed them. Sue was also deeply involved in charity work, supporting causes like the Argus Appeal, Martlet's Hospice, and Rocking Horse, a children's charity that was close to her heart. Friends described her as vibrant, loving, and relentlessly supportive. She was a matriarch in every sense, not just to her family, but to her city. So when news broke on January the 7th, 2021, that Sue Addis had lost her life, the shockwaves hit hard. This was a life-changing event for Pietro, her 17-year-old grandson, a boy she'd once described as gentle, bright, a little lost maybe, but still full of promise. A boy she'd invited into her home just a few days earlier. She wasn't moving him in as a punishment, but she believed he needed saving. Pietro Addis was no stranger to hardship. His parents had separated when he was young, and sadly his mother passed away when he was just 6 years old. After that, he was raised primarily by his father Leo in Brighton. Teachers noticed early signs of emotional turbulence. Pietro struggled to focus in school. He was often distracted, impulsive, and prone to outbursts of frustration. In 2018, he was diagnosed with ADHD, and he was placed on Elvance. This is an amphetamine-based medication made to help with concentration and mood regulation. But despite this prescription, things didn't seem to improve. He had trouble settling into mainstream school, eventually transferring to a local catering college. He worked part-time at Donatello, his grandmother's restaurant. But even that, under the protective eye of grandmother Sue, it wasn't enough to anchor him. By 2019, he had started using green. It was casual at first, and then it became habitual and daily. Over time, arguments with his father escalated, and Pietro became increasingly withdrawn, defiant, and erratic. There were rumours that he was selling off his clothes to be able to afford more substances. At home, tensions peaked when family members caught him misusing his medication. He was taking higher doses of Elvance than necessary to chase a high or to stay up all night. By December 2020, the situation was unmanageable. After a particularly intense argument with his stepmother over flushing his ADHD medication, Pietro was asked to leave his father's home. So that's when she invited her grandson to come and stay with her, just for a while, just until things settled. To her friends, Sue said she was worried, but she was hopeful. She wanted to help him get clean. She still believed that he could be helped. What she didn't know though, what she couldn't have known, was just how far things had already spiraled. There was the green, the ADHD medications, and a young man sinking deeper into the darkness. Cedar Gardens is a quiet cul-de-sac in the Withdean area of Brighton, and it offered peace and privacy for this tough situation. Sue liked to keep her home in pristine condition. She was organised, nurturing, and she was still working part-time despite her age. But as the week wore on, Sue began to see the cracks emerging. Pietro still wasn't attending college. He was missing shifts at the restaurant. He would spend hours alone in his room or slouched on the couch, listlessly. Other times he'd snap at nothing, he'd fidget, or just go completely silent. To friends, Sue confided that Pietro was acting strangely. She started to feel unsure and unsettled. Still, she loved him and she didn't give up. Sue was 69, a cancer survivor, and was the only surviving parent of Pietro's father, and the weight of that responsibility was falling squarely on her shoulders. Just days into the new year, she was no longer just a grandmother, she was the last person standing between Pietro and complete collapse. It seems she was also the only one still trying to help him. It turns out the substances that Pietro was using were far more serious than anyone thought. The cocktail of substances in his system in the months before the events of this video was quite staggering. Tests would later show green, that substance that's made for horses, that white one off of Scarface, the bricks that rappers love, and even his grandmother's breast cancer medication, letrozole. He was of course also misusing Elvance, his prescribed ADHD stimulant, as well as reportedly taking Adderall on top of it. This combination was toxic. Family members began withholding prescriptions, hoping the break might help him reset his brain. But Pietro resisted. He craved Elvance. He said it helped his anxiety and claimed it made him feel less paranoid. In truth, it was very probably just feeding a dangerous instability. His behaviour became erratic and alarming. He was punching walls, punching himself, and was no longer leaving the home for anything productive. And whilst he was in the house, he would pace up and down or self-isolate. She contacted his old doctor, the one who had diagnosed him with ADHD, and she asked him for advice. She was told that he should see a therapist. And on November 29th, 2020, she searched online for psychologist youth in Brighton. She followed up with online searches for mental health clinics. On January 7th, 2021, she searched for the Priory in Ticehurst, a private clinic that treats addictions and mental health conditions. She also checked the driving distance from her house to the clinic, and that search suggests that she was now ready to take the next step and would arrange inpatient care for Pietro. That's how determined she was. But she also knew that time was running out. In her own words, the family was having problems with Pietro. On some nights, he would stand outside his grandmother's bedroom door repeating, "I love you, I love you, I love you." And through all of this, Sue tried to remain calm. She tried to continue to be supportive, but she was truly, deeply concerned. On the morning of January 7th, nothing seemed out of the ordinary. Sue made breakfast, Pietro showered, and there were no visible signs of a breakdown or an argument between the two. No neighbours reported hearing anything unusual. This is the same day that Sue searched for the Priory Clinic online. It wasn't just a vague idea anymore, it was a plan that was forming in real time. That evening, the two ate dinner together, and according to what Pietro later told doctors, there was no indication of conflict, but somewhere between the meal and what followed, something shifted. Pietro claimed he believed his grandmother meant to harm him. He said she had gone to the kitchen and had returned with sharp implements, that she left them there, and that he took them. Pietro retrieved multiple sharp implements from the kitchen. Experts for the defense would later argue this was a moment his transient paranoid psychosis took hold, that he genuinely believed Sue intended to hurt him. He entered the bathroom while Sue was in the tub, and he then lunged at her over and over. 4 of the 17 times he lunged at her were said to be catastrophic enough on their own that any one of them would have ended Sue's time on this earth. In fact, one completely severed a rib. After he did what he did, Pietro stood up, he changed his clothes, and then at 7:06 p.m, he called emergency services. And this is that call. I have removed some pauses, but the body of it is all original.
Sussex Police Emergency.
I'm calling to tell myself.
Okay, what's your name?
Pietro Addis.
How do I spell your name?
Pietro.
Perfect. And your surname?
Addi.
Brilliant, thank you. Okay. And where are you at the moment?
1 Caesars Gardens.
1 Caesars Gardens, is that? Okay. Give me 2 moments. Do you have a postcode for that? Hello? Hello? Hello, is anyone there?
Hello?
Hello? I just need to get some more information from you. What town is that in?
Brighton.
Gotcha. And that's Cedars Gardens, yeah? Okay. And so, when you say you're going to hand yourself in, what is it that you've done? Hello? Hello, you there? Hello? Okay. What's your date of birth? We'll work with that.
March 30th, 2003.
Okay. So when you say you're going to hand yourself in, what do you think you've done?
There's been a murder.
Okay. And where's that happened?
1 Caesars Gardens.
Okay. And who's been murdered?
My grandma.
Police and paramedics were already on their way. When officers arrived just minutes later, Pietro was waiting outside. He was calm and distant. He led them into the house. He led them into the bathroom. Sue was found submerged in red water in the bath. A sharp kitchen implement lay on the bath mat. Another was lodged beneath her. A third, larger one, was later discovered in Pietro's bedroom, hidden inside a jacket. During the attack, Pietro focused on the neck, the chest, the torso, arms and legs. Loving grandmother Sue had likely never seen this coming. Pietro was arrested on the spot. Officers noted that he was composed, and he was answering questions in a flat, detached tone. It didn't feel like a breakdown to them. This felt like a decision. Here is all available body cam footage of this event, and it's worth watching in its entirety. Don't worry, it's not too long either. It's just very strange and very disturbing.
Hello. unlock the door.
1 o'clock, you saw good. Okay, what's happening? Okay, at this moment, I'm arresting you on suspicion of murder, okay? Just 2 seconds.
You didn't have to say.
Where is your nan?
In the bath.
Where?
In the bath?
Child room at 104.
Bathroom,
Male
yeah.
has been detained on suspicion of murder.
Upstairs. Is anyone else in the house?
No.
You take him.
Yep.
People are dead.
It's just you in the house. And it's Pietro. What's your surname?
Addis.
Addis. What's your date of birth? Okay. Upstairs.
Where's the weapon?
It was a knife.
Where is
It's
it
a
now?
knife.
Is it on your person?
Possibly.
Where, mate?
He hasn't been searched.
Where is it?
Either in my pocket or in the box.
Pietro.
Find it.
Is it in the property?
Yes.
Where in the property?
In the bathroom.
In the bathroom or the kitchen? And was it just one knife?
Yes.
Can you confirm when did he do it? How long ago was it?
Pietro.
How long ago?
An hour.
An hour.
Approximately an hour, just a little approximately 1 hour ago. Yeah, paramedic stuff. Just grab quick numbers or names or something so we know.
Okay, so we'll take you to custody.
But yes, all medical, no one else.
Has anyone else been in the house? No, just you and your nan. Have you taken your medication? Do we need to take that with you?
Where is that?
That's right. You can take your medication to custody if you need it. Yeah? What do you take, mate? If you tell us, we can take it with you if you need it.
It's not there.
Where is it? Do you live somewhere else normally?
Okay.
Okay, we can figure out how we can get collected the medication you need, yeah?
What medication is it?
L1s? What's that for?
ADHD.
ADHD.
Do you suffer with any medical conditions that we need to be aware of to look after you?
Where do you know I live, sorry?
Do you have any medical conditions?
Just
I think I broke my hand.
When? Now?
earlier.
Earlier.
Which hand?
Punching the wall.
Which hand is it?
This one.
Your right one.
This one. Whereabouts do you think it hurts it? We can get the nurse in custody to have a look at that. Okay. Do you have any mental health conditions we need to be aware of? Apart from the you said ADHD.
Anything else? Pietro, where do you normally live?
The other house.
Your other house? Is it nearby?
You have 3 rights when you get to custody, okay? You have the right to let someone know, notify that you've been arrested, okay? You have the right to free and legal independent advice, okay? So a solicitor, which can either be if you have one in mind, if you know one, or a duty solicitor can be contacted to come and speak to you, okay, and then represent you if you so wish. Then you have the right to read the Codes of Practice, okay, which is a long rule book about what we can and can't do whilst you're in custody with us, okay? It's boring, I'm not going to lie to you, but it will pass some time, okay?
You might have to have what we call an appropriate adult interview because you're under 18. So that can be...
Can I get my medication?
You want your medication?
Of course you can.
Yeah. Oh my gosh, man. Nice and calm. There's a lot of people out there.
Don't panic.
After you, mate.
Thank you. Okay, okay.
You go, mate.
Okay, see ya. Okay. So I'll take you to custody, alright? Okay? Yeah, keep going. You're sitting here for us.
At trial, Pietro Addis admitted to ending his grandmother, but he denied that it was murder. His legal team argued that he was experiencing paranoid psychosis at the time, that his ability to form rational judgment or to control his actions was impaired. They brought in a psychiatrist, Dr. Peter Misk. He testified that Pietro genuinely believed his grandmother did mean him harm, that the psychotic break that he suffered from was brief and transient, and that it had resolved without medication soon after the event. He didn't know what he was trying to do, Dr. Misk said. He thought she was going to kill him. However, the prosecution had its own expert, Dr. Duncan Harding, and he did not agree. Harding called Pietro an unreliable malingerer, someone just pretending to be mentally ill. He reviewed body cam footage from the arrest, and he concluded that Pietro was lucid, calm, not disorientated, not confused, and not psychotic. Harding said it was anger, not delusion, that led to his grandmother's passing. He also pointed out that Pietro had been in escalating conflict with his family, that his access to substances, both illegal and his ADHD medication, was being restricted, and that Sue, as the family matriarch, was trying to arrange treatment against his wishes, and that the location of the sharp implements, the number of markings on Sue's body, and the act of changing clothes afterwards all indicated planning and not panic. Perhaps most damning of all though, Pietro showed no signs of psychosis after his arrest. He wasn't prescribed antipsychotics in hospital. His cognition was described as intact. He also had the presence of mind to call the police. He didn't try to flee, and he didn't appear out of control. The judge called it a high degree of responsibility, despite the jury accepting a partial defense. Because what mattered wasn't just the state that Pietro was in, it was the choice that he still could make. On May the 5th, 2023, Pietro Addis stood before Judge Christine Lane Casey at Lewes Crown Court. He was no longer the teenager who had stepped into his grandmother's home 2 years earlier, but he wasn't now a free man either. The jury had accepted his plea of manslaughter by diminished responsibility, rejecting the charge of murder. Judge Lane acknowledged that Pietro had been a child at the time of the event. However, she would not absolve him. "This is an utterly dreadful example," she said, "of what can come from misusing substances, including prescription medications." She emphasized that if Pietro had not been using green, had not been misusing Elvance, it's highly unlikely that this would have happened to Sue. And yet, in the face of unimaginable loss, the Addis family extended compassion. Sue's children and grandchildren told the court that they still loved Pietro, that they believed the greatest punishment was knowing what he had done. Pietro Addis was sentenced to just 15 years, 10 in custody and 5 on extended license. He'll serve at least 2/3 before he's eligible for release, and when that day comes, he'll walk free. If he returns to his family, one seat at the table will always be empty. When Christopher Boone showed up in Laura Mortimer's life, his history wasn't just checkered, it was already marked with extreme violence. 8 years prior, in early 2010, he was convicted of attacking a previous partner, along with the partner's mother. That attack happened in front of 2 young children. He was given a suspended prison sentence for assault, for battery, and criminal damage. So he served no actual jail time, this was just a warning on paper, possibly the first of many arguable decisions by the system. Christopher met Laura Mortimer in 2010, a woman that had a daughter from a previous relationship named Ella Dalby. There's no indication that Laura had any idea about Christopher's previous conviction when she met him later on in that same year. And crucially, no one told her. This case was before the wider rollout of Clare's Law in the UK, a legal tool that allows someone to request disclosure of a partner's criminal history. It meant that Laura had no formal way of accessing his record unless she or a loved one specifically asked police for access to that information. At that point, at the start, Christopher was far from a monster to Laura. He was charming, helpful, and exactly what Laura, an ambitious young mother and wedding planner, wanted to believe in. But by this stage, he'd already had a lot of practice at hiding the truth, and the criminal justice system didn't seem to be holding him to account. Within just weeks of meeting Laura, Christopher had moved into her home, and within just a few months, she was pregnant. To the outside world, things looked like they were moving fast, but like the couple were happy. Laura was building her own bridal business, a business which she cutely named Sweet Beginnings. She was lively, determined, and known for making other people's dreams come true. Behind closed doors, though, the cracks were already forming in the relationship. But regardless of this, the two would still get married. It turns out that Christopher was controlling with money. Every bit of Laura's income went into his bank account. Over time, the woman began withdrawing. Her family noticed the weight loss. They saw that she was exhausted, and they felt the quiet tension that hovered over her every move. But whenever they asked her what was going on, she would just brush it off. She could handle him, she said. And even if she couldn't, it's not like he'd been physical with her, at least not yet. It was Boxing Day, the 24th of December 2014, when Laura ran out of her home wearing only her underwear. She was hysterical, she was injured, and she was absolutely terrified. She banged on her neighbour's door and told them that Christopher Boone had attacked her. When police arrived, they were there within just 6 minutes. Photos were taken of Laura's injuries, and officers spoke to neighbours, the people who had witnessed her distress firsthand. And crucially, they heard something from daughter Ella, who was just 8 years old at the time. Ella had seen and heard what happened to her mum. She made comments at the scene that corroborated Laura's version of events. But despite that, no formal effort was made to secure her statement. The officers did arrest Christopher that night, and he was taken into custody and then interviewed by a domestic abuse specialist. At that time, he denied hurting Laura, and not long after, Laura began walking her story back. She now told officers that she didn't want to press charges. She didn't want to go through a trial, and she didn't want to escalate the situation. She said that she'd be okay, and so she went back home with him. What police didn't do was follow up with daughter Ella. They had a credible witness that was in the house, and they let her voice go officially unheard. This moment, according to the Serious Case Review published years later, was the one and only known physical incident by Christopher against Laura or Ella before what happened. And it was a moment that, against all odds, was still somehow missed. So, despite the mounting evidence, no charges were ever filed against Christopher. Gloucestershire police later said that while their officers acted swiftly, the decision not to prosecute was in line with policy at the time, and without Laura's cooperation, it was deemed that there wasn't enough to proceed. However, the review would later find otherwise. There was plenty there to build a victimless prosecution. There was Laura's initial statement. There was her visible injuries. There were the statements of their neighbours who helped her. Of course, there were Ella's words. And there was proof of Christopher Boone's past. What it seems was missing, though, was the will to link it all together. Frustratingly, no effort was made to involve outside agencies. No specialist consultation to pursue charges without Laura's support. There was no safeguarding team that followed up on Ella's experiences. So Christopher was set free with no charges, and Laura's bruises would heal. However, the pattern had already been set, and he learned something important that night, that there were no real consequences, not for him at least. By 2015, Christopher's dark behaviour had moved underground. There were no more obvious injuries. There were no late-night police calls. But his control on Laura was tightening. He completely controlled her money. Her business that she'd been working so hard on, that money just went straight to him, and Laura never seemed to have any money of her own. Christopher managed her time too. Family later learned that she only had one front door key, and Christopher had the back door key. He kept control of the keys to the house, which is made even worse when I remind you that this was actually Laura's home. She had to be home when he returned, or he couldn't get in. He isolated her slowly and deliberately. Her visits with family became less frequent. Calls went unanswered, and when she did show up, the brightness had faded from her eyes. Friends and loved ones did try to check in, but Laura downplayed everything. Only one time, when Christopher was seen with another woman, did Laura react with visible anger. Christopher responded to this, though, by threatening the friend who'd seen him and told Laura. He warned them and their family to watch their backs. At home, Laura was now walking on eggshells, and Ella, although young, she was watching everything and knew exactly what was happening. She loved her mother, and she wanted to protect her from this invader in their home. Between 2010 and 2018, Ella's behaviour at school was flagged multiple times. She was struggling to focus. She was now acting out, and she was defiant with teachers. Eventually, she was diagnosed with ADHD, but no one asked why a happy, expressive child had now started withdrawing. Very possibly a misdiagnosis. No one asked her what her home life was really like. Perhaps after the first incident, she realised that no one in authority would even listen. And to make things even worse, every time there was a meeting at school, Christopher Boone made sure he was there. Ella's biological father, Tom Dalby, was left out. He was never called in. He was no longer included in the decision-making. And in one case, Christopher even claimed that Ella was a liar. He'd say anything to protect himself. During this time too, Laura and Christopher would bring 2 more daughters into their world. Exactly what home was like for the girls, I honestly dread to think. It's just awful to even begin to consider. Laura now started visiting her GP often. She came in for stomach pains, backaches and fatigue. She sometimes also had notable weight loss. On another visit, she had injuries to her legs. But each time she visited the doctors, the physical symptoms were treated. But the context, the pattern of these issues, both were seemingly ignored. No professional connected the dots, and none of them ever asked Laura the question that may have saved her life. Is someone hurting you at home? By May 2018, Laura had made her decision. She was done. She told her friends that Christopher had gone for her again, and this time she wasn't backing down. She wanted a divorce, and she gave him a deadline. He now had 2 weeks to move out of her house. 10 days before the final event, Christopher Boone punched a wall in a fit of rage. His hand was injured badly enough that it had to be set in a cast. But the most chilling of all wasn't the act of striking the wall, it was what he said when he did it. That was meant for your face. Laura was now actively trying to move forwards. On May the 27th, she went out to the pub with friends. She laughed, she danced, she told them she was ready for a fresh start. Her business was thriving, her girls were now all growing up, and to make things perfect, she just needed him gone. When she got home that night, she FaceTimed her aunt at 1:18 a.m, and that would be the last time that anyone outside of that house would see her alive. There is a framework developed by criminologist Professor Jane Monckton Smith. She studied hundreds of domestic homicide cases and found that they often follow a chilling, predictable pattern. These are 8 stages that build over time. Stage 1 is the pre-relationship history of control or abuse. Christopher Boone had that. There was the prior conviction in 2010 for what he did to his previous partner and her mother. Stage 2 is moving in quickly. He moved into Laura's home within just a few weeks. Stage 3 is escalation of control. This is through isolation, financial restriction, or intimidation. Remember, he took her income. He managed her door keys. He tried to cut her off from friends and family. Then stage 4, a trigger event. Laura discovered that he'd been out with another woman. He wasn't happy. Stage 5, a change in thinking. Christopher began to feel that he was losing control and that the tables were now turned against him. Stage 6 is planning. He punched the wall and threatened her, refusing to leave. And then there's stages 7 and 8. Stage 7 is the act itself. Sometime in the early hours of May the 28th, Christopher attacked. Laura bravely fought back against her husband. She had defensive marks across her arms and hands. She was jabbed at 18 times, 13 of those to her face and neck. Brave daughter Ella, hearing the chaos from upstairs, got out of bed. She was 11 years old. She ran towards the danger. She tried desperately to help her mother. And so, Christopher Boone turned on her, too. She was jabbed at with a sharp implement a disgusting 24 times. Some strikes were so forceful that they splintered bones. Her mother's red DNA on her feet showed that she had entered the room whilst Laura was already in severe trouble. But even that didn't stop her from trying to help. Ella and her mum were found lying side by side on the kitchen floor. The two youngest girls were still inside the house, alone with the bodies. They were, however, thankfully, alive and not physically harmed. But for them, nothing would ever be the same again. Stage 8 is the aftermath of the attack. Christopher fled the house and called his mother. He told her what he'd done, and together they called the police. And then he simply waited. Police arrived just 10 minutes later. Christopher Boone was obviously arrested, and here is an excerpt from his police interview. As you can see, his cast is still on his arm from his previous threats towards Laura.
Grounds and reasons for your arrest. You were arrested yesterday, the 28th of May, 2018, at 6 o'clock in the morning on Sandhurst Lane in Gloucester. You were arrested on suspicion of the murder of your wife, Laura Boone, and your 11-year-old stepdaughter, Ella Dalby, both of who were discovered deceased at your home address of 4 Dexter Way in Gloucester in the early hours of the morning.
In the aftermath, Laura and Ella's family didn't just disappear into silence. Instead, they bravely stepped into the chaos. They started demanding change. Laura's mother, Hilary Stinchcombe, and Ella's paternal grandmother, Kim Clements, became relentless advocates for justice. Together with Laura's sister, Jo Piontek, they took on the institutions that they believed had failed them. When the Domestic Homicide Review first came out, the family was horrified. Early drafts described Laura as, and I quote, a rubbish mum, and implied that she drank too much. This was not only inaccurate, it was heartless and insulting. Laura wasn't weak. She wasn't a bad mother. She was surviving. She was running a business. She was protecting her children, and she was trying to escape. The family fought for the report to actually reflect the truth. And amazingly, they won. With the help of advocate Sue Hale from Advocacy After Fatal Domestic Abuse, they reshaped the review into something actually meaningful. It now stands as a case study in systemic failure and also as a call to action. But their work didn't stop there. They've pushed for mandatory training on coercive control. They've called for better listening to children's voices. And they fought for a centralised system to track repeat offenders, so patterns like Christopher Boone's can't be buried by disconnected files. As Sister Jo put it, if we save the next child or the mother's life, it is worth everything. In November 2018, Christopher Boone stood in Bristol Crown Court. He had initially pleaded not guilty, but that changed, quietly and coldly, just before the trial. He now admitted to both murders. The judge didn't hold back. She described the attack as wanton savagery. Laura had fought for her life, she said, and Ella had bravely come to the aid of her mother and must have witnessed the attack before Boone turned the knife on her. The court heard about Christopher's past convictions, about the 2014 assault, about the countless signs that were missed. Laura's mother Hilary spoke through tears. She called her daughter a wonderful, devoted mother. She called Ella her beautiful, adored first grandchild. Ella's father Tom said, "Every day I feel the terror and pain that Ella must have felt in those last moments of her life." More than 1,000 mourners filled Gloucester Cathedral for their funeral. Christopher Boone was sentenced to life in prison, and he will serve a minimum of 29 years. But even with this in mind, there is no punishment in the world that could bring Laura or Ella back. The Morrison Campus Alternative School in Dallas, Oregon, wasn't Karissa's first high school, but it was the first place that she ever felt truly safe. She enrolled there after a rocky stretch, where she was grieving the passing of her father, navigating addiction recovery, and trying to stabilize her life. Morrison was for kids who were slipping through the cracks, and that's exactly where Karissa had been. But the small classes, patient teachers, and the second chance mindset gave her the structure and support that she really needed. It became more than just a school, it became her second family. She kept in touch with her teachers long after graduation. They watched with pride as she went from barely passing to actually tutoring other students, as she traded chaotic relationships for a focused life plan, and as she started dreaming about something bold and selfless, as she now planned to become a teacher. Karissa was drawn to the kind of students that others overlooked. She knew exactly what it felt like to be judged, what it was like to lose a parent. She wanted to be the calm in the storm for someone else. After graduating from Morrison, Karissa wasted no time in building a better future. She enrolled at Chemiquita Community College, where she juggled coursework with part-time jobs. Her goal was a teaching degree from Western Oregon University. It was never easy, and money was definitely tight. She moved in between roommates, her mother's house, and even slept on couches when she had to. But everything changed in 2016, when she gave birth to her son, William Allen Fretwell II. She named him after her dad, and she called him Billy. At just 22, Karissa became a single mother, and she never looked back. She worked security shifts late into the night, sometimes grabbing only a few hours of sleep, before her college classes started again the next morning. She took on swing shifts at a soy sauce factory in Salem. But as well as that, she volunteered at Morrison to fulfill her school practice hours, and this left her just enough time to study into the night, whilst Billy slept. Every decision she made centered around her son. She chose to pay 6 months of rent up front to avoid housing instability, and she organized her life to make sure that Billy never felt the weight of her struggles. But the struggles were always there, they were just beneath the surface. Childcare alone ate up more than 30% of her income every single month. She had hoped that she'd be able to raise Billy entirely on her own, but by 2018 she knew that she needed help. She filed for support from Michael Wolf, Billy's biological father. Karissa didn't want a relationship with Wolf. In fact, she rarely even mentioned him by name, but she did want her son to have what he deserved. And even more than that, she wanted him to have the chance to know his father, if that father was willing to show up. However, the father fought at every turn. He disputed the support order. He told her to stop being dramatic. But still, Karissa bravely didn't back down. Billy had Karissa's blue eyes, as well as her fierce determination. He was bright, funny, and endlessly active. He loved Elmo, Jack from The Incredibles, and chasing soccer balls across the grassy patches near their apartment complex. Karissa's friends called him a blonde blur. He adored water, any kind, anywhere. Kiddie pools, puddles, the ocean, anything. He would light up on FaceTime calls with relatives. He gave tight, toddler-sized hugs, and wherever he went, he brought joy. Karissa posted online often about her son, photos of him at the coast, sat on her shoulders, holding her hand on an empty road. In one Facebook caption, she shared the words of a Creed song, "You come to me with arms wide open, you rest your head on my shoulder and hold me tight." Billy's bed was shaped like a race car. His toys, Sesame Street figurines and plastic trucks were scattered across their one-bedroom apartment. He and Karissa shared the bedroom closet. However, she gave him the master bedroom, meaning that he could sleep undisturbed, while she worked late into the night on homework. She often spoke with friends about just how exhausted she was, how the weight of parenting, school, and work was almost getting too much. However, one thing she never complained about was Billy. He was her reason for everything. Karissa's friends said that Billy kept her grounded, that he was the light that she clung to when the rest of life started feeling uncertain. Karissa met Michael Wolfe the way many people meet regular customers. It was through routine, repetition, and proximity. She was delivering sandwiches for Jimmy John's in McMinnville, and Wolfe was a frequent caller. But he didn't just order lunch. Instead, he specifically started asking for Karissa every single time. At first, it might have felt flattering, or well, maybe not. He was an older man. In fact, he was older by more than 2 decades, and he worked in security at Cascade Steel Rolling Mills. He actually helped get Karissa a part-time job there, and that's why she was working security shifts just like his. It's unclear exactly where their relationship turned personal. Karissa kept it pretty private. Unlike other romances that she posted freely about online, she never mentioned Wolfe by name. In a private Facebook group for moms, she later shared that she found out that he was in fact married only days after learning that she was pregnant. She ended things with Wolfe immediately. She didn't want to be responsible for breaking up his marriage, but by then it was already too late. Billy was on the way. When she told Wolfe that she was expecting, he didn't react like her father-to-be. According to friends, he instead offered to pay for an abortion, but Karissa declined. She prepared for life as a single mother, leaning on friends, teachers, and community resources. And Wolfe, for his part, sent occasional gifts, but he never spent any real time with Billy. He never contributed financially. He never took on a father's role. But what he did do, though, was linger in Karissa's life. She told friends that Wolfe would show up unannounced at her apartment, and that he did in fact have a key, because he once co-signed a lease for that property. Karissa also suspected that Wolfe had hired someone to follow her. She thought maybe he was trying to gather evidence to challenge her parenting. She said that he was controlling, that he made her feel uncomfortable, but she never really went too far into detail. Even her closest friends struggled to understand the dynamic of the relationship. It was hard to tell if he had been a secret boyfriend, an occasional hookup, or something else entirely. But one thing was clear, Karissa just didn't trust him, and she did fear what he might try to do next. Karissa had previously done everything she could to avoid involving Wolfe in Billy's life, but by 2018 she felt out of options. The cost of raising a child alone, whilst also attending college and working full-time, it all added up to a crushing weight. And while she hesitated at first, she eventually filed a claim in Polk County Circuit Court, requesting child support. Wolfe contested it. Firstly, he demanded a DNA test to disprove the claims. However, that backfired, and he was in fact confirmed to be Billy's father. So he then argued that the calculations were unfair, even though the court documents showed his gross monthly income was actually close to $3,800. All of this meant that the legal process dragged out for months. Karissa told her friends that Wolfe was sending her creepy messages during that time. That Christmas, he mailed her a package full of toys for Billy, along with a separate box for Karissa. Inside it was lingerie, sweatpants with Juicy printed across the back, and a laminated card promising an intimate favour. Karissa wasn't endeared though, she was disgusted. She wanted him to stop sending gifts or she'd have to tell his wife. He just brushed off these threats though. He told her she was being dramatic, but then came the court order. In April of 2019, a judge ruled that Wolfe must pay $904 a month, but just 3 days after the final paperwork was signed, rather than making life better for Karissa and Billy, things got unimaginably worse. May the 13th, 2019 began like any other Monday. Karissa picked Billy up from his babysitter at around 4 p.m, and then they likely went home to their West Salem apartment, with Billy's race car bed, his Sesame Street toys, and the small shared space that was their sanctuary. But that night, something unthinkable happened. At 8:45 p.m, security cameras captured Michael Wolfe leaving his post at the steel mill. He got into a golf cart, drove through a tree line, and then disappeared into the night. By 9 p.m. though, his phone was pinging near Karissa's neighbourhood. Karissa never arrived for her overnight shift at the soy sauce factory. Additionally, she never contacted anyone, and from that moment forward, neither she nor Billy was ever seen again. By 2:45 a.m, Wolf was back at Cascade Steel, caught on camera carrying a white trash bag. This was instead of his usual backpack. His mobile phone records showed that he returned to his home in Gaston by 4:30 a.m. The very next day, Karissa's phone sent a strange text from near Wolf's property. Police refused to release the details of that message, nor will they share who it was sent to, but from then on, Karissa's trail fell silent. On May the 17th, a concerned relative went to Karissa's apartment and she found the front door was unlocked. The television was still playing, her glasses, wallet and both cars were still there. Nothing made sense. Salem police opened a missing persons case, one that would quickly turn into a full-blown manhunt.
Now, a week and a half since they went missing, her friends fear that the father of Fretwell's child had something to do with it.
I know they had some problems because he was married, and she was a little scared of him because after she got pregnant, he did threaten her at one time.
There was yelling, screaming. We heard the child crying. We heard saying, "Get away."
She says her husband and other neighbors called police. Did you hear anything specific about what was being said?
Just said, "Get out, get out." That's all I heard. But we could hear a kid crying. So to us, that's, a thing to call on. I would say it was violent, screaming.
And you heard a man's voice?
Mm-hmm.
And multiple neighbors recall hearing several arguments between Fretwell and a man, including one fight a couple of months ago where police were called.
Wolf was questioned and he denied any involvement. He said that he hadn't seen Karissa since a child support hearing in April. And he said that he hadn't been to Salem in over a year. But as we know, the cell data and surveillance told another story.
At a vigil Monday night, friends, community members, even strangers came together for a mom and son who've become near and dear to them.
I am hopeful, very much.
Mikkel Moats organized the gathering. She says it's not a memorial for Karissa and Billy. It's the opposite, a show of support for their safe return.
We're trying to remind people that we're still out here looking, we're still hopeful, we're still looking for answers, and that it's just important that anybody that has any information to come forward, no matter how small or big it may seem.
Investigators traced Wolf's movements, they gathered search warrants, and listed him as a person of interest. A week after the disappearance, he was arrested outside a donut shop in Portland. Witnesses said that he made strange comments to female employees.
I would never guessed. I met him a couple weeks ago. He was quiet, nice. There wasn't anything odd. It was just a neighbor saying hi and has a dog.
I don't know. It's just odd. It's just you see it on the news all the time of somewhere else or a different place, and then next thing you know, it's just right next door. So it kind of makes you wonder.
Following a search warrant, police said that they found substances on his property that were capable of sedating a human being. They also found rope and tarps, items that were purchased just after Karissa and Billy vanished, and at that time they still both remained missing. And then on the morning of June the 15th, searchers returned to a wooded area near Yamhill Timberland where Wolf had firewood permits and which was close to his fishing spot. And this time they found something. Roughly 800 feet from a previously searched zone, 2 bodies were discovered beneath unnatural debris. They were wrapped in tarps, together. It was Karissa and Billy. Karissa's time on this earth was ended by a single blast to the head, and Billy's cause remains undetermined, but this confirmed that neither one of them would ever be coming home. The years that followed were filled with grief, anger, and endless courtroom delays. Karissa's family, once silenced to protect the case, could now finally begin speaking out. Her mother, Nyla, wore a shirt with both of their faces on it. It read, "Gone but not forgotten," as she stood before Wolf in court. She loved that little boy so much, she said. The courtroom was packed with investigators, prosecutors, and family members who'd waited for over 3 years for this day. The legal journey had been exhausting, dragged out by appeals, new laws and technicalities. For Karissa's sister Katrina, the sentence didn't bring her any peace. She read her victim impact statement through tears, her voice trembling as she told Wolf, "You put a dollar amount on 2 lives." She shared how her own young son When asked in class what he wished for, he didn't wish for toys or games, he just wanted his aunt and cousin back. Wolf sat in a suit, almost entirely obscured behind his attorneys. He didn't speak, nor did he apologize. He just blinked and looked shaken as his sentence was read. He received life in prison, with no parole for 30 years. By that time, he'll be in his 80s. Wolf's defense had fought over whether the death penalty could be applied, but in the end, his guilty plea took that option off the table. As Wolf was led out of court, he paused briefly at a collage of Karissa and Billy. He looked at their photos, the woman that he had seemingly groomed, the son that he had never raised, and then he walked on. Jonathan Stasiak and Jerry White had known each other for years. White was a well-known figure on the Isle of Wight. He was a Conservative councillor, a respected publican, and later in life a man dedicated to community service. He ran 2 pubs in Sandown, and he'd employed John as a chef in both of them. By all accounts, Jerry was generous. He was encouraging. He was a man that believed in second chances, and he often extended a hand to people who needed direction, and John was one of those men. Over time, their professional relationship evolved. Both men would become involved with a local volunteer project, Lake Community Gardens. This was a 16-acre plot, meant to serve as a therapeutic farm, a place to help vulnerable people grow food and to find purpose. John was trusted enough to become a trustee, where he would work alongside Jerry. But things didn't stay civil for too long. Behind the scenes, frictions began to grow. John claimed that Jerry used the garden merely as a dumping ground for pub waste, and there was a total of £3,025 between 2 different transactions that caused a major issue, but I'll talk more about that in a moment. John didn't just hold a grudge, he let it grow and fester, and privately he began speaking in disturbing terms. He began making threats. He hinted that violence may be the answer, but it seems nobody believed that he would actually do anything. To anyone on the outside, the tensions between John and Jerry did look kind of petty. At most, a clash of egos between 2 men with very different personalities. But to John, it was very personal. He believed that Jerry had bullied his partner, Marianne. He believed he was being disrespected, undermined, and dismissed. This was both in public and behind closed doors. And worst of all to John, he believed he was being cheated. At the heart of this feud was money. There was a £3,000 donation from the local Rotary Club, which is a charity, and that money was intended for roof repairs at the garden. John was convinced that Jerry had claimed the full amount, even though the actual work, he said, only cost around £1,300. And then there was a £25 argument. That small sum, allegedly owed to Marianne for petrol, became a symbol in Jonathan's mind of everything that Jerry stood for, that being manipulation, arrogance, and dishonesty. And every minor issue that would come up, from damp firewood deliveries to plants being dumped near the sheds, added fuel to this fire. John kept tally. He started building a case in his mind, and in his head, Jerry wasn't just a difficult colleague, he was now a thief, a liar, and a threat. Jonathan's paranoia spiraled. He described feeling targeted at meetings. He believed decisions were being made behind his back. And eventually, he claimed that the entire community garden was being used simply as a front for Jerry's personal gain. Whether any of this was actually true didn't seem to matter anymore. By late May, John wasn't looking for compromise. He wasn't hoping for a resolution. He was just waiting for a chance. And that chance arrived on Bank Holiday Monday, the 27th of May, 2024. John and Marianne had spent the weekend camping out at the gardens. Marianne had just left to head home, and Jonathan, he stayed behind, and he had a plan. According to Marianne, there was no warning signs. She said Jonathan had been completely normal that morning. In fact, she could even describe him as relaxed. They'd been gardening together, they'd been walking the dogs, and enjoying the sunshine out in the wilderness. However, Marianne had no idea that just hours earlier, John had messaged his friends with a chilling phrase, Tomorrow, I go to war. Jerry arrived alone and late that morning. John saw him from a distance, and he just decided to seize his moment. He entered the garden's clubhouse. Inside was a chainsaw, something that was kept on site for maintenance work. He took it, fueled it up, and started it. He then followed Jerry down a woodland path near the lake. In Jonathan's words, it felt like a movie. He claimed to be watching himself from the outside, but his action suggests he was anything but detached. He revved the chainsaw and struck Jerry from behind. He was swinging into his legs. Jerry fell to the ground. He pleaded John to stop, but the attack continued. When the chainsaw cut out and could no longer be restarted, you'd think that this may be the end of the attack, but instead, John turned to his bare hands. He now throttled Jerry and then smothered him. Witnesses would later recall hearing John scream, "Die, bastard, die," and then there was silence. John decided not to run. He sat there for a while, he had a drink and collected his thoughts. He then picked up his phone and dialed 999. He told the operator, "I've just murdered someone." When the operator asked if Jerry needed an ambulance, John's reply was chilling. "I'm going to make sure he doesn't." Police arrived just minutes later and found Jerry in the bushes. His time on this earth had come to an end. John Stasiak didn't resist. He didn't flee or lie or try to hide what he'd done. In fact, he seemed weirdly proud. When officers arrived, he led them directly to the scene. And even faced with what he'd done, John showed no emotion. As police cuffed him and walked him back to their van, John glanced back and said, "I hope the bastard is dead." This is the full available body cam footage from the arrest, and it's almost impossible to imagine what John had just done. The whole thing is eerie. It's not too long, and it's definitely worth watching.
You John Steskowik? Steskowik. Okay.
No,
Did you... Steshuk, I'm sorry. Did you say you're confused, John?
No.
Okay.
No, you were confused.
Well, yeah, we were. We weren't sure which direction
to
find you.
I'm not fucking confused.
John, based on the call you've made to us, before we go any further, I need to arrest you on suspicion of murder. Okay. So you don't have to say anything, but it may harm your defence if you don't mention when questioned something which you later rely on in court, and anything you do say may be given in evidence. Do you understand what I've just said? Okay, and the reason for your arrest, obviously, is for a prompt and effective investigation and to prevent further harm to anybody.
Yep.
If you can show us where the gentleman is, does he need medical attention?
Don't think so.
Okay. Where are we going? Okay. All right, let's just double lock those. Okay.
That's a bit harsh.
So I just need to make sure double locks.
If they tighten if you don't double lock them. We don't want to hurt you, mate.
Because you're handcuffed, I don't want to pull you over.
Okay, that's fine.
And whereabouts are we looking, sir?
We're going in here.
Yep. Any dogs in or anything? No.
It's just opening it.
Just push it.
Push.
Where are we looking, mate?
Keep going.
How far down then?
100 metres.
100 metres?
Yep.
Are we just following this? Should we keep John here, do you think?
Yeah, we're going to stay here then.
Yeah,
It's 100 metres straight, yeah?
Yeah.
Okay, cool.
Back at the police station, John gave a full account across 6 separate interviews. He told police that the attack was deliberate, that he picked up the chainsaw to give himself the edge in a confrontation that he had long fantasized about. He described the chainsaw as the most formidable item available. He acknowledged that he did want to finish the job. Jonathan said that he was glad Jerry was gone, and he would repeat this time after time, showing that there was no remorse. Detectives said that the only moment of hesitation came when they asked him why. He offered vague explanations, misunderstandings, disrespect, and petty grievances. He of course mentioned the £3,000 donation and the £25 petrol debt. But to the normal person, none of this added up to murder. This was personal and festering, and somehow it had finally erupted into this horrific event. The man they arrested was calm, articulate, and chillingly detached. One officer later said it felt like interviewing someone describing a dream, not a real-life murderer. At trial, Jonathan tried a different approach. He denied murder, and instead he pleaded guilty to manslaughter on the grounds of diminished responsibility. The defense presented new psychiatric evaluations. One expert diagnosed John with autism spectrum disorder, and another suggested that he had autistic traits, but he didn't meet the full criteria. Jonathan himself told the court that hearing the diagnosis helped him to make sense of what had happened. He claimed the attack felt like he wasn't in control, and compared the scene to being in a movie. He talked about watching himself from the outside and acting without fully choosing to act. However, would the judge and jury be convinced? Midway through the trial, just before closing arguments, John abruptly changed his plea to guilty of murder. When asked why, he said he had misjudged the situation and now saw how callous his actions had been. However, his remorse would come far too late for the court and far too late for Jerry White's family. The murder left a hole in the heart of the community. Jerry had been more than a counsellor or a landlord. He was a mentor, a father, a grandfather, and a trusted friend. His widow, Lee, said the pain of knowing how he passed was unbearable. His son Desmond called it the bitterest irony that his father had been taken by someone he had once employed and helped. And yet, even as the court reeled from the brutality of the crime, Marianne stood by her fiancé. She publicly forgave John. She said she still wanted to marry him, and whilst this means that she faces abuse in the street, including assault, she told reporters she believed John would never hurt her and never do anything like this again. Her loyalty only deepened the community's confusion and grief, because while justice was being served, the scars were only just beginning to show. In his closing remarks, the judge didn't hold back. He described the chainsaw as an especially vicious weapon and said Jonathan had brought it that day, intending to remove Jerry White's legs, and he was so determined that when the machine cut out, he instead moved on to manual methods. The judge acknowledged the autism diagnosis but made clear, saying, "You're obsessed over perceived, although relatively trivial, grievances, and to such an extent that you allow them to build into a form of hatred. Nothing, no check dispute, no garden squabble, no petrol money justified what happened on that day. And behind every chilling detail revealed in court was the reality of a stolen life." Lee White, in a powerful victim impact statement, said, "Losing my husband under such horrific and unbelievable circumstances has led to major shock and anxiety. Knowing what he went through is hard to bear. Life has changed and cannot be normal again. I have underlying sadness for Jerry, but also fury and anger too." Desmond White added, "Dad was too generous and accommodating to the wrong people. People often took advantage of him." Jonathan Stasiuk now serves his sentence behind bars. The garden he once claimed to care for does remain, and so does the silence he left in his wake. In November, Judge Christopher Parker Casey delivered the final word. He sentenced Jonathan Christopher Stasiuk to life in prison with a minimum term of 25 years before parole can even be considered. For 6 years, Anthony Goodwin and Harry Messenger lived just a few steps apart in the small cul-de-sac of Crispin Close in Faversham, UK. Their friendship, at least on the surface, seemed easy. Neighbours would often see them laughing together, sharing drinks, or cooking meals in each other's homes. The two men were in their 60s and 70s. Both of them had once lived rougher lives, but those days now seemed long past. Harry had a serious criminal record tied to substance trafficking, and Anthony had a long string of offences from his younger days, and these included violent offences but he hadn't done anything like that in more than 40 years. Their bond was built on familiarity, long conversations, and of course a shared fondness for alcohol. But this friendship wasn't as simple as it looked. Neighbours also recalled heated arguments between the two men. One neighbour even remembered seeing Anthony behaving aggressively, and he was aiming this towards Harry just weeks before the events in this video. Both of the men were known to drink heavily, and when the drinks started flowing too freely, tensions sometimes started to build. On May the 18th, 2023, those tensions would explode into something that could never be undone. That night, Anthony spent several hours drinking at the Brent's Tavern, before then heading over to Harry's bungalow. Harry, for his part, was also already well into the night of drinking. By later testing, he was found to have consumed the equivalent of 2 bottles of red wine plus vodka chasers, and he'd also taken tramadol. Neither of the men were in a state to handle a disagreement. At first, it was just words. It was a drunken argument, sparked by something that Harry said about an airplane. Anthony later described it as something silly. Yet somehow, in their intoxicated state, it escalated with shocking speed. According to Anthony's own version of events, Harry suddenly became agitated. He then claimed that Harry, normally calm, charged at him like a bull and began striking him with his fists. Moments later, Harry allegedly produced a hammer, a tool that he kept in a drawer in his kitchen. Anthony said he wrestled it away, and, now in fear for his life, he struck Harry back. At just after 3:30 a.m, neighbours said that they heard 3 heavy bangs echoing from Harry's bungalow, and then there was silence. What Anthony did next, instead of calling for help, was he left Harry laying on the floor. He then returned to his own home across the cul-de-sac. There he washed his clothes, and he got changed into clean ones. And then as dawn broke, he casually walked back to Harry's home. He started ringing the doorbell, and he was trying to call Harry on his mobile phone, acting as if nothing had really happened. However, witnesses described his behaviour that morning as strange, saying it was almost performative. What Anthony didn't realise at the time, as it was actually leaving a trail, and it would answer some tough questions for detectives. At 4:11 a.m, just 40 minutes after neighbours heard those heavy thuds, Anthony sent a chilling text to his brother. It said, "No, I just murdered someone." Still though, at this time, with Anthony believing what he believed, he made no attempt to call emergency services. It is possible that Harry could have been saved if he had. Instead though, he waited. He just wandered back and forth between his bungalow and Harry's, and he continued to make half-hearted attempts to contact him. In fact, it wasn't until nearly 12 hours later, on the afternoon of May the 19th, that Anthony finally dialed 999. The call was recorded, and it painted a disturbing picture. Anthony spoke slowly, he was almost nonchalant, and this is part of that call.
Can police close your emergency? Good afternoon. My name is Anthony. I was over my friend's house last night, a neighbour of mine, and we got into a bit of a dispute. I'm trying to ring him, and I'm getting no answer. We did have a bit of a quarrel over there, you know. So what is your concern? What have you called the emergency line for? Yeah, I think the one artery was ran apart. Oh, so are you calling to report the fight? No, I'm not. He's not responding. Because I hurt him, you know. Okay, what's his name? Harry Messenger.
He admitted to hitting Harry in the head with a hammer. However, he still insisted that it was done in self-defense. Throughout the call, you may have realised that he minimised the severity of what had happened. There was no urgency in his voice. There was no sense of panic, and there was no sense of fear. By the time paramedics and police finally arrived, Harry Messenger had been gone for many hours. The hammer, still stained with red, was found lying beside his lifeless body. And Anthony's story, a story of a desperate struggle for survival, would soon be put under the microscope. From the moment that investigators entered Harry's home, the scene told a story far different from Anthony's claims. The hammer that lay beside him was soaked in DNA and covered in tissue. There were no signs of a major struggle anywhere else in the house. There was no smashed furniture, no broken glasses, no overturned tables. In fact, nothing that would normally suggest a wild brawl. Instead, the scene looked quite clinical. It was targeted and deliberate. Harry's injuries were devastating. The forensic pathologist catalogued no fewer than 18 blunt force injuries located on Harry's head, face and neck. In fact, his skull had caved inward in multiple places. It said his face was fractured beyond recognition. His ear had nearly been torn from his head. And on top of all this, the claw end of the hammer had been used to deliver 13 blows to Harry's chest. The tightly packed markings showed a focused rage rather than a panicked defense. Anthony, by contrast, showed only minor facial bruises and scratches. He had no broken bones. There was no internal injuries, no wounds consistent with being repeatedly attacked with a hammer. Detective Inspector Ivan Beasley, the man who led the investigation, later said the multiple wounds found on the victim, including the fatal wound to his head, inflicted by such a weapon as a hammer, proved that Anthony Goodwin intended to kill Harry Messenger. Combined with Anthony's behaviour after the attack, the washing of his clothes, the text he sent to his brother, and the delay in calling 999, all of this evidence painted a devastating portrait. This was simply murder, and soon a jury would be asked to weigh Goodwin's story against the grim and undeniable facts. Anthony Goodwin's trial began at Maidstone's Crown Court later that year. From the beginning, his defence was clear. He still insisted that he had acted only to protect himself. He described Harry as flying into a sudden rage, claiming that he had been attacked without warning, that he'd been punched and then threatened with a hammer. The judge, Jeremy Carey, rejected Anthony's version of events outright. "I am satisfied you could have left his home at any point, even when he had the hammer in his hand," the judge told him. Continuing, "You stayed because you were angry with him." Evidence from a neighbour, Shannon Gibson, further undermined Goodwin's case. She described seeing him act aggressively towards Harry just 2 weeks before the event. Both of the men, it seemed, were known to drink heavily, and sometimes they would clash when intoxicated. The jury deliberated for over 6.5 hours, and when they returned, their verdict was clear. Anthony Goodwin was guilty of murder. He showed little visible reaction as the decision was read out. This man, who had once shared drinks and laughter with Harry Messenger, would now share a prison cell with a stranger instead. And this friendship that had begun so easily somehow managed to end in the worst way imaginable. On sentencing day, Judge Carey addressed Anthony Goodwin directly. He described the attack as one carried out with great brutality and said that it was fueled by alcohol. He acknowledged that both men did have criminal pasts, but he also emphasised that neither man had committed any violent offences for several decades. That night, the judge said that the two men had simply lost their tempers and that it was over something relatively trivial. But what mattered now was the irreversible outcome. Harry Messenger, a father and grandfather, a man deeply loved by his family, was gone, and Anthony Goodwin would live with the consequences for the rest of his life. The judge imposed a life sentence with a minimum term of 13 years before the man could even apply for parole. Goodwin remained mostly silent as he was led away. Outside the courtroom, Detective Inspector Ivan Beasley offered words of comfort to Harry's grieving family. "I hope this verdict is of some comfort to the victim's family and friends." For the other residents of Crispin Close, the sense of safety and familiarity they once knew had now been forever shattered. One argument, one moment of uncontrolled rage had destroyed not just a life, but an entire family and a community's peace. The small white hatchback lay crumpled against a lamppost. Its roof was crushed and its wheels still spinning in the air. Police body cam footage captures a sobbing woman slumped in the back of a patrol car. Her voice, trembling and panicked, breaks the grim silence. "Who's dead? Please tell me who's dead." Long before the night that Truman Hubb lost his life, Carla Dodds had already survived a tragedy behind the wheel. As a teenager, she'd been a passenger in a fatal crash, one that should have been a wake-up call. After witnessing firsthand how quickly life can just be snatched away, how the reckless choices of others can shatter families, this should have left a lasting impression, but it didn't. Friends and family had hoped that the earlier accident would be enough to change her mindset. Instead, it seemed to fade into the background of Carla's fast-moving social life. The lessons that she could have learned about the value of caution, about responsibility, and just how precious life is, all of them were ignored. By 2022, Carla was a 25-year-old barmaid living in Whitley Bay. Popular, lively, and known for her infectious energy, she loved nights out, live music, and big groups of friends. She was the life of the party, but sometimes, and often, the life of the party teeters on the edge of disaster. As one former friend would later say, she always thought she could handle it, no matter what she drank, no matter how reckless a situation seemed. She thought she was invincible. When Carla climbed into her Hyundai i10 on that cold November night, she had already crossed several invisible lines. She just didn't know that this time there would be no coming back. That night had started innocently enough. Carla finished her shift at a bar in Whitley Bay, where she'd been pulling pints and laughing with regulars. But when her shift ended, the real party began. She headed to a local nightclub where the drinks kept on flowing. Carla would later claim that she only had 2 glasses of wine and 2 tequila shots that night. But witnesses remembered things very differently. They described her as lively, flushed, loud, and unmistakably intoxicated. Sometime after midnight, a plan was made. There was another party happening and it was just a short drive away, and Carla, full of bravado, offered to drive. Friends piled into the car, and it wasn't just reckless, it was dangerous from the start. As the vehicle wasn't meant to carry 6 passengers, one person squeezed into the boot, and 4 others crammed across the back seat, knees pressed against the windows. Still, the mood inside the car was electric. Music blasted, people sang at the top of their lungs, and Truman Hubb, just 22 years old, was laughing along with the others. At one point, he leaned his head out of the rear window, feeling the cold night air whip against his face. No one inside that packed car seemed to realise just how close they were to disaster, at least not yet. The Hyundai sped through the dark streets of North Tyneside. It was weaving between lanes. Carla pressed harder on the accelerator. She was laughing along with singing and barely glancing at the road. In the front seat, a friend shouted over the noise, "Slow down," but Carla didn't. Behind the wheel, her judgment was clouded. She was impaired, distracted, and trying to keep up with the chaotic energy around her. The heavy weight of too many passengers shifted the car's balance, and this made every sudden movement even riskier. The road that they were on, the A191, wasn't particularly challenging, but at high speeds, even the smallest mistake could be fatal. Up ahead, a slight bend approached, and Carla didn't react in time. The car clipped the curb, and then, almost in slow motion, it veered into a lamppost. The impact was devastating. The tiny car flipped onto its side, with metal screeching and glass shattering. Inside, screams filled the air, then were cut short. Truman Hubb, the young man who had been smiling just moments earlier, suffered catastrophic injuries. Within just seconds, the laughter and singing had been replaced by sirens, gasps, and a stunned silence. But even as her friends lay trapped and broken, Carla made a choice that would define the rest of her life. She ran. When emergency services arrived at the A191, they found a scene that was almost too chaotic to process. The small white car was mangled beyond recognition. Debris was scattered across the road, illuminated by flashing blue lights. Inside the wreck, Truman was discovered amongst the crumpled seats. Despite desperate attempts to save him, his injuries were far too severe. He was pronounced at the scene. And to add to the tragedy, Truman hadn't even made it to the new chapter that he'd been so close to starting. Recently diagnosed with autism and ADHD, he'd been weeks away from receiving medication that promised him a clearer, easier path forward. His family had been excited and hopeful, but that night ended all of those dreams. Rosalind Hubb, Truman's mother, would later describe that moment as the beginning of the most horrific journey of her life. A journey filled with endless grief, sleepless nights, and a silence where Truman's laughter once lived. Life is unbearable, she said in her victim impact statement. I try to get through each day, but my heart is dead like Truman's. Meanwhile, officers at the scene noticed something odd. The driver, the one person who should have been checking in on the injured, was nowhere to be found. In the critical minutes after the crash, Karla made a series of split-second decisions, and none of them were about helping anyone other than herself, and none of them were about taking responsibility. Stumbling away from the wreckage in the early morning darkness, she left Truman and the others behind. Witnesses later described seeing a woman sprinting from the scene, looking panicked and disorientated. Police tracked her down quickly. When they caught up with her, she was sobbing, swaying on her feet and visibly intoxicated. The body cam footage from that moment would become infamous, and here it is.
02. Were you 28? Okay. I'm arresting you on suspicion of causing death by dangerous driving. Okay. And causing serious injury by dangerous driving. Okay. You don't have to say anything, but it may harm your defence and your pension. When questioned, anything you do say may be given later on in the court. Okay, do you understand? Do you understand that?
A breathalyzer confirmed what officers already suspected, that Karla was nearly twice the legal drink-drive limit. And yet, even as the reality began to sit in, Karla focused on herself. She focused on her own fear, her own fate, and not on Truman, nor on the family who would be forever broken by her actions. And worse still, this would not be the end of Karla's recklessness. While awaiting trial for causing death by dangerous driving, she was caught once again. Pulled over for speeding, she tested positive for smoking a mild substance. Even facing the weight of a young man's demise on her conscience, Karla still continued to show the same disregard for the law and for life. In early 2024, Karla Dodds finally stood trial at Newcastle Crown Court, but she denied causing death by dangerous driving. However, would the jury agree? Throughout the trial, Karla's behaviour drew scrutiny. When she took the stand, Judge Roger Thomas Casey noted that her testimony was filled with self-pity, not with genuine remorse. She left the scene and ran away to do her best to get away with it, the judge remarked. Everything about this case shows self-pity rather than true remorse. The courtroom heard devastating victim impact statements from Truman's family. His mother, Rosalind, described Truman as her sunshine, the youngest of her 3 sons, full of laughter and mischief. She spoke about his struggles with masking his autism and ADHD, and how he had been so close to finding a new sense of peace and normalcy before his life was taken away. Rosalind shared haunting memories, holding her son's clothes in his empty bedroom, waiting in vain for him to walk through the front door. Dreams of a future, helping him, supporting him, all obliterated in one moment. She didn't mince her words about Karla either. She called her actions wicked and cowardly. She said forgiveness was impossible. We get a life sentence, Rosalind said. There is a huge hole in our lives that cannot be filled. Defense lawyer James Doyle tried to paint Karla in a kinder light. He described her as a warm-hearted and kindly soul, someone who deeply regretted her actions. But the judge and Truman's family saw it differently. The truth was brutal. A split-second decision had destroyed multiple lives. After just 4 days of evidence, the jury would find her guilty. This is a case of very dangerous driving, with a number of very dangerous features to it, the judge said. He described Karla as highly impaired, and also noted that she had ignored passengers' desperate pleas to slow down. On March 21st, 2025, Judge Thomas sentenced Karla Dodds to 12 years in prison. She was also banned from driving for 13 years and 9 months. The sentence brought a small measure of justice, But for Truman's family, no legal result could ever erase the pain of his loss. No sentence could restore the son, the brother, and the friend that they cherished. Outside the courthouse, Sergeant Dave Roberts, the man who led the investigation, spoke plainly. A split-second decision to drive under the influence can ruin countless lives forever, and there is simply no excuse. For Rosalind, Hilton, Miles, and everyone who loved Truman, their journey of grief continues. Every day without him is another reminder of what was stolen that night.
I just have no idea what happened to her, where she is. Nobody does, and it's pretty terrifying.
Hatch Park was still dark when the Lyft driver pulled away. It was just after 3 a.m. on a Monday. 23-year-old McKenzie Lueck had landed in Salt Lake City only 1 hour earlier. She was returning from her grandmother's funeral in California. Now, she stood alone beneath the trees, wheeling her suitcase across the grass towards a parked car. There are many questions that remain unanswered, but what we do know is that within minutes, her phone was powered off and it would never be switched on again. And the man who was waiting for her had already turned off the security cameras in his house. By sunrise, he'd be cleaning up the scene, and by nightfall, he would light a fire that no one could ignore. But it would take nearly 2 weeks, a dozen warrants, and a backyard excavation before police realized just how deep and dark this case would go. McKenzie Lueck was the kind of young woman that people knew for her warmth. Born and raised in El Segundo, California, she was close with her family, and especially her grandmother. That's why when her grandmother passed away in June of 2019, McKenzie flew home without hesitation. The funeral was difficult, but while she was there, she kept in touch with friends, texting them updates and photos. By Sunday night, June the 16th, she was heading back to Utah, where she studied kinesiology at the University of Utah. McKenzie was ambitious. She planned to graduate in 2020 and had spoken to advisors about nursing and even medical school. Outside of class, she worked at a biological testing lab and was a member of the Alpha Chi Omega sorority. Her life was full of plans, promise, and people who adored her. Just after 1:30 a.m. on June the 17th, McKenzie's flight touched down in Salt Lake City. She sent a text message to her mother to say that she'd landed safely, and then at 2:42 a.m., she climbed into a Lyft taxi. However, McKenzie didn't head home. Instead, she directed the driver to Hatch Park, about 20 minutes away. When they arrived at the destination, she told him that she was meeting a friend. The driver said she didn't appear scared or nervous. She got out of the car, wheeled her suitcase across the grass, and met someone waiting in another vehicle. The Lyft driver then drove off. This would be the last time that anyone would see McKenzie Lueck alive.
North Salt Lake residents on alert tonight as police continue to investigate in and around Hatch Park, the last place 23-year-old McKenzie Lueck was seen.
We had the undercover units in our apartment complex right across the street, just driving around, looking at everything, looking in everything.
Today, police releasing the last known photos of McKenzie Lueck at the Salt Lake City International Airport, where she arrived early Monday morning, took a Lyft ride from the airport, and was dropped off here at Hatch Park in North Salt Lake around 3 a.m.
At this time, we cannot confirm the make and model of the vehicle that picked up McKenzie, or the description of the person at Hatch Park on June 17th.
Which brings us to these cameras at the park.
Hatch Park doesn't have any cameras. We have some dummy cameras.
Cameras that might have captured critical clues aren't cameras at all, according to city manager Ken Leatham.
This park's on a main street. It's right near the police station, and so it gets a lot of attention and a lot of eyes are on this park.
But at 3 a.m., very likely empty.
Salt Lake City Police just had 3 vehicles just go down the road.
Those who live across from the park say police continue asking for nearby surveillance footage, patrolling the neighborhood, searching for McKenzie Lueck.
McKenzie and Ayoola Ajayi had first connected months earlier. They met on a website called Seeking Arrangement. It was a controversial platform that catered to sugar daddies and sugar babies. And while it did carry a stigma, McKenzie's friends didn't judge her. She was independent, financially conscious, and she wasn't naive. But what no one knew was just how dangerous Ayoola truly was. On the surface, he seemed accomplished. Originally from Nigeria, he was a US resident with a green card, and he'd worked IT jobs with recognizable companies. He'd even served briefly in the Army National Guard. But behind closed doors, there were warning signs. At Utah State University, Ayoola was kicked off campus in 2012 after visa violations and a theft investigation. When he was allowed to return in 2015, he didn't last too long this time either. He studied computer science, but he never graduated. In 2018, he self-published a novel. It was titled Forge Identity, that featured a teenager entangled in a world of violent crime. 2 characters in the book are burned after being murdered. But things got even worse. There was also The Room. Just 2 months before McKenzie disappeared, a contractor came forward with a chilling account. Ayoola had asked him to build a secret soundproof room situated beneath his front porch. He wanted it finished quickly. He said it must have no windows. The walls were to be fitted with hooks. A biometric fingerprint lock was to be put on the door. And when he was asked what all this was for, he simply claimed it was a place to hide alcohol from his Mormon girlfriend. The contractor thankfully refused the job, because to him, something about the request felt off.
And a local contractor has come forward, claiming Ajayi asked him in April to build a soundproof, hidden room behind a secret door at the house.
Never. I've never, ever had anybody ask me anything like this.
After he turned down the job, Ajayi persisted, making repeated requests through texts.
He was adamant about getting it done really fast, and money was no object, and he needed to get it done before his girlfriend came into town.
Later, a house cleaner would confirm that Ayoola's home was loaded with surveillance cameras, especially in the bedroom. None of this was known to McKenzie. By the time she stepped into his car at Hatch Park, he had already disabled his home security system, and he'd already decided exactly what he was going to do. McKenzie's family hadn't heard from her since she sent a text message to her mother at around 2 a.m. on June the 17th. At first, they just assumed she was busy, but when she missed a midterm exam, when she failed to feed her cat, and when she didn't show up to a wedding that she planned to attend back in California, alarm bells really started ringing. This is a 911 call made by McKenzie's father, Greg Lueck, when he started to realize that something wasn't right.
Yeah, I'd like to get, if possible, have a wellness check done on my daughter. I've been trying to get a hold of her all week. I was just wondering if I could have somebody maybe go by her house and check on her. Last time we heard from her, she got off the plane coming back from LA. It was 1 a.m. She was going to grab an Uber and go home, but that's the last I've heard from her.
So 1 a.m. this morning?
No, 1 a.m. Monday morning. So we've been trying to get a hold of her all week. Usually it's unlike her to return a call, but it goes straight to voicemails.
And does anyone have a key?
I don't know. The landlord may. I don't know of anybody that would be there besides her roommates that would have a key. You know what? I take that back. She said she dropped one behind the mailbox, but she could never get it out. So there may be one back there. Somebody can fish it out, but I don't know if she ever got it out or not.
Her friends now panicked too. Kennedy Stoner, a close friend and sorority sister, spoke to the media in those early days. She said McKenzie had been devastated by her grandmother's passing. However, she said this disappearance felt entirely out of character. She's close with her family, Kennedy told reporters. She wouldn't just vanish. Police launched a search. They traced McKenzie's movements after she landed at Salt Lake City International Airport. Surveillance footage showed her retrieving a brown suitcase from baggage claim. She looked tired but calm. Investigators then spoke to the Lyft driver who'd picked her up, and he confirmed that he dropped her off at Hatch Park and that she willingly got into another vehicle. He said that she didn't seem distressed and that she didn't signal for help.
Remember, I was actually going to turn off my my app and go home, but right then I got another order to go pick somebody up downtown. So I just went to go pick up that person. They seemed to know each other really well because I I think all I heard was, "How are you doing? How are your trip?" Just kind of basic greetings. The situation seemed very safe. She obviously knew the person that she was getting into the car with.
Investigators found that her final text message was sent at 2:58 a.m. and it was to Ayoola Ajayi. Her phone powered off 1 minute later. Very quickly, detectives zeroed in on Ayoola.
Police say it was an Instagram follow made by McKenzie's account yesterday that played a part in leading them to this home. Now, it is listed as an Airbnb by the homeowner. We know that several search warrants were executed in this case, one being for this home last night. Today, no one answering. And just before 1 this afternoon, multiple Salt Lake City police officers were back on the scene using what looked like binoculars to look at the home, but they didn't go inside. Many of them also canvassing the neighborhood in the backyard. You can see the area where police dug up.
Our detectives collected multiple items of evidence throughout the night that are in the process of being tested and analyzed. This will take some time. Last night, several people made us aware of a mattress and box spring that were given away from the residents at 547 North, 1000 West in Fair Park. We ask those who took those mattresses or box springs to please contact the Salt Lake City Police Department at 801-799-3000.
His story just wasn't adding up. He completely denied knowing McKenzie at all, but their phone records told a very different story. So on June the 26th, police served a warrant and then began an exhaustive search of Ajayi's home. They brought in dogs, forensics teams, and excavation equipment. What they found shifted the investigation from a missing persons case to something far darker. Ajayi's neighbour actually noticed that some strange burned items had appeared in her garden. She contacted the authorities and they attended her property. This is the body cam footage from that visit.
Is it okay if we come back there and look? Is that okay? Hey, Sarge. You good for a minute? Yep.
So.
First aid after fire. You've talked to the detectives and everything?
Yeah.
Okay.
Right there. The quality stunk really bad.
Behind Ajayi's garage, police uncovered a freshly dug area of soil. It didn't take long before that soil gave way to evidence that nobody wanted to find. There was human tissue, bone fragments, charred fabric, and something far more chilling. What appeared to be part of a human scalp. Hair was still attached. Elsewhere on the property, officers recovered McKenzie's burnt personal items. This included her student ID. They also found a red gas can. Tests on the remains that they found in the back garden were confirmed to be that of McKenzie Lueck.
This is the suspect's backyard. Right here is where police dug multiple holes in the ground. It's here where cops say they found charred human tissue matching McKenzie's DNA. They also found personal items that were burned belonging to McKenzie.
And so it was that it fell on Chief Brown to notify McKenzie's parents.
This is one of the most difficult phone calls I've ever made. As both Greg and his wife Diana were devastated and heartbroken by this news.
And inside Ajayi's car was the unmistakable smell of gasoline. However, even with everything they'd found, there were still some vital pieces of evidence missing. This is the body cam footage of Ajayi's arrest.
What's going on, man?
So, detectives are ready to talk to you about everything that's going on real fast, so if you want to come, I'll give you right back to the house real quick.
But there's Fox News over there.
I know, I'm going to drive you back in my car. It's a Camry, so...
We'll stay away from the news.
Yeah, we're not going to go by the news.
But I don't want my face on the news.
I will do that so it does, okay? So stand up real quick.
We're just going to... Oh, are you arresting me or something?
No. Stand up.
Then why you're going to be detained for a little bit.
You're being detained But just for a second, okay? I gotta put you in handcuffs just while we're driving.
Per policy, we're
policy.
just gonna go talk to detectives for a little bit.
Why are you detaining me? Because you need to talk to detectives, and I need to transport you back. So my policy says every time someone's in my car, they will wear handcuffs. So that's why they're.
But there's a news over there.
They can come right back.
We're probably not going to take. We'll take you to another spot so you're not by the news.
Okay.
We just hung up.
How did the news find out?
Yeah, we were wondering the same thing.
I just want to make sure there's no weapons looking. So some money.
Earlier you said we could take your phone and download it. Are you still willing to do that or no?
I just need to call my lawyer and see if it's okay, because I want to help as much as I can.
Sure.
But she's saying that some police just want to pin it on someone, that they can pin it on me.
We have had a week and a half now to prepare, and we have been very busy because I care about McKenzie, and I want her. I think you did care about her. I agree. And I know that there's more for you to tell me, and you're holding back, and I don't understand why. AJ, I just told you that your phone records and the location put you up at the meet. Do you think, honestly, and expect me to believe that you ended that conversation and somehow you and her location end up in the exact same spot?
Oh, I'm not doubting you. If I see that too, if I'm in your case, I would be asking myself, what are you asking me right now?
It's not a miraculous question.
Yeah, I agree with you.
Okay.
Stuff doesn't just happen.
No.
Yes, I agree with you.
I'm telling you to explain that. And so far, you have not.
Well, how do I explain something I don't know?
On July the 2nd, with mounting pressure and forensic evidence now stacked heavily against him, Ayoola Ajayi did something unexpected. Through his attorney, he told police where to look next. Ayoola's home sat in the Fair Park neighbourhood of Salt Lake City. From the outside, it looked like any other suburban rental, grey, square and quiet. But inside, something monstrous was just waiting to happen. Once he got McKenzie inside, he bound her by the wrists, using both zip ties and rope. He began to manually throttle her with his hands. She begged him to stop. She tried to fight, but he carried on. Instead, he flipped her onto her stomach, and then used a belt to assist him in his attack. He pulled on it until her time on this earth came to an end. Ajayi didn't call for help. There was no remorse, and it seems there was no panic. This was what he wanted. So he got to work. He took some of her belongings and threw them into the Jordan River. Then he dug a shallow grave in his backyard and buried her body. The next day, he returned to the grave, and this time he brought gasoline. Neighbours would later recall the smell, thick and chemical. One of them saw him standing over a fire pit with a red gas can in his hand. This was the same gas can police would later find in his car. Receipts confirmed that he purchased this can just hours after McKenzie vanished. Logan Canyon is known for its winding roads and scenic trails. It's where people go to disconnect, where they go to breathe deeply, to hike and to heal. But on July the 3rd, 2019, searchers followed Ajayi's directions into Logan Canyon. This took them about 85 miles north of Salt Lake City, and there, in a wooded clearing off of a dirt road, they found another shallow grave. It was almost hidden beneath trees and brush. Upon digging, they found more of what he had buried for a second time, more charred remains. Zip ties still bound her arms behind her back. There were more fragments of clothing matching those in the backyard. It was clear McKenzie had been moved, burned again, and then left to decay in silence. Phone records placed Ajayi in that exact location on June the 25th. This was just one day before police knocked on his door for the very first time. It seems he panicked, and instead of confessing, he dug her up and drove nearly 90 miles north to hide her body for a second time. What Ajayi didn't realise is that every mile left a trail, his digital footprint, surveillance footage, gas receipts. His lies were unravelling faster than he could bury them. McKenzie had been found. The case went to court.
I spoke with McKenzie's family this morning,
Another devastating call. Despite their grief, we hope this will help them find some closure and justice for McKenzie.
At this time, we will have a statement from the Lueck family read by McKenzie's uncle.
The Lueck family would like to express their gratitude for the effort put forth by the Salt Lake City Police Department and all partnering agencies that assisted, as well as all of the people that provided tips on this case. They are also grateful to her community, her friends, and others around the nation who have supported this investigation. The family will not be taking any questions, and no interviews will be held. Inquiries should be directed to the Salt Lake City Police Department. Again, we ask that everybody respect the privacy of McKenzie's family and friends at this time. Media requests and statements for the family will be taken by the Salt Lake City Police Department. Thank you.
On October the 7th, 2020, Ayoola Ajayi stood before a judge and pleaded guilty to aggravated murder and to desecration of a human body. It's now he admitted everything. He also pleaded guilty to violating another woman, someone he had met on a dating app in 2018. She came forward after seeing McKenzie's story in the news. The evidence against him was overwhelming, but it was more than just physical proof. His entire history pointed towards this moment. The disturbing blueprint had been unfolding long before McKenzie ever boarded her flight. This was premeditation to the nth degree. Prosecutors had considered seeking the death penalty, but with his guilty plea, Ajayi avoided it. In exchange, McKenzie's family was spared the anguish of a drawn-out trial. The perpetrator sat in court in an orange jumpsuit, his head lowered, offering an apology the district attorney would call hollow. My daughter, McKenzie Lueck, was a sweet, amazing young lady with the world ahead of her, her father said. I will never have the opportunity to see her blossom in life. The court heard from her cousin too. This is a nightmare you can't wake up from. On October the 23rd, 2020, 3rd District Judge Vernice Trees delivered the sentence. Ayoola Ajayi would spend the rest of his life in prison. There would be no chance of parole. She also added 5 more years for desecrating McKenzie's body. In the courtroom, Ajayi spoke briefly. I'm sorry for what I did, he said, but no one believed him. Not the district attorney, not McKenzie's family, nor the friends who had waited for justice for over a year. In the end, the question of why was never fully answered. Ajayi gave no motive. Prosecutors suggested it was simply to know what it felt like, to live out a fantasy. There was no argument, no fight, no history between them, but there was a lot of planning, and a plan that he carried out. And for a brief time he thought he got away with it, but McKenzie's life left traces, and those traces led to the truth. A quiet cul-de-sac in a sleepy corner of Derbyshire. One officer knocked on the door. Another circled to the side gate of the house, and then they saw him. The man made some insane claims that left the officers visibly puzzled. The looks of confusion they gave each other were clear, but moments later, inside that house, they found out he wasn't lying, and what they discovered inside would destroy the lives of everyone it touched. And to somehow make it even worse, it wasn't just senseless, it was entirely preventable. This should never, ever have happened. It was one of those early autumn Saturdays where the air feels softer, like summer hasn't fully left yet. On Shando's Crescent in Kilamarsh, a quiet street just outside of Sheffield, 3 kids were running a makeshift sweet stall. Plastic tubs of lollipops, fizzy belts and sour cherries, sold to neighbours to raise money for a cancer charity. Lacey Bennett, 11 years old, was full of energy that day. She'd roped in her best friend Connie Gent, who was staying over for the weekend. Her big brother John Paul, who was 13, helped to set up the table, and their mum, Terry Harris, snapped pictures from the doorway. She posted to a community Facebook group, and the caption read, "Like to thank you for the lovely comments. The kids will be back out tomorrow at the park, or Shando's Crescent. Thank you for your support." And the comments rolled in. They said things like, "Well done to your kids. They were so polite. Credit to you. Lovely to see something so positive." And Terry tagged the 3 children in the posts so that they could read the compliments themselves. She was understandably proud, visibly, radiantly proud of the kids. That night, the children watched movies. Connie had asked to stay for a second night, and her mum said yes. Lacey had a thing for TikTok dances and boy bands. Connie loved music, and she was already talking about what they were going to wear for Halloween. John Paul was quieter, he was more observant, but he still enjoyed himself. He had a thing for bugs and insects, and he wouldn't hurt one even if it landed on him. Mother Terry, 35, worked in care. She had strong opinions about West Ham United, but that didn't compare to the strength of the bond that she had with her kids. Friends called her fiercely loyal. Her mum called her my rock. And that Saturday night was completely ordinary. It was fun, but it was peaceful. Nobody walking past the house would have sensed what was coming. In fact, no one possibly could have predicted something this unpredictable. The next day was supposed to be another day of sweet selling and sunshine. Terry Harris had finally started to feel like things were settling down. She had her new partner, Damien Bendel, and the pair met online after her last relationship ended. It was still early days, but he seemed calm and polite. He was a bit rough around the edges maybe, but he wasn't unkind. He moved into the family home during the summer of 2021. Terry was raising her kids mostly on her own. John Paul had now started secondary school. Lacey was growing up fast, with all the personality and sass of a girl who dreamt of TikTok fame. Life was full, but manageable. There was new school routines and a kind of domestic rhythm where laundry and packed lunches become the heartbeat to the full life of each week. To friends, new partner Damien didn't raise any alarm bells. To the legal system though, those bells should have been ringing loud and clear. And this is because when Damien Bendel gave Terry's address as his own, and he did it in order to satisfy a court-ordered curfew, the system accepted it. He was on probation, recently sentenced for an arson offence. The condition of his release was to be at home at night, and to stay inside that address. And in this instance, that address was Terry's. But no one warned her exactly what Damien was capable of. He had been labelled low risk to public, to partners and to children, but that label didn't come from a deep dive by the legal system. Instead, it came from surface level checks. It came from rushed paperwork. It came from boxes being ticked without time to read the files beneath them. The probation office worker who'd reviewed his case had only been in the job for 6 months. She said that she simply didn't have time to scroll through his full criminal history. And this meant that whatever information was held there, Terry wouldn't find it out either. So the mother welcomed him into her home, just as she would have welcomed any other partner. She made space for him, she made dinners for him, and she made it work as a new family. And in doing so, she unknowingly let something else into her home, something dangerous, something the state had failed to catch. You see, in June of 2021, Damien Bendel walked out of court with a suspended sentence for arson. He'd set fire to a property in Swindon, an offence that was serious enough to land him behind bars. However, instead, he was allowed to return to the community, but he was now under a strict curfew. That curfew required him to stay each night at a specific address, and that was Terry Harris's home in Shando's Crescent. And the court accepted this, and from that moment on, her house would become part of his dark world. What no one realised though, not the judge, not the officer writing the report, not even Damien's own probation team, was that placing him there was like striking a match next to a pile of dry leaves. Damien's file should have set off alarms. He in fact had a documented history of violence. He'd previously been in relationships where DV was alleged. He was also flagged internally as posing a potential risk to children. But most of this information never actually made it to the report that the judge saw, and the probation officer who assessed him, she admitted later that she didn't read all of his documents. She only read 2 out of 10 risk reports. Some of that history was slightly hidden. It was tucked into the closed sections of the system that wasn't visible to all staff. So most of his history, potentially the darkest parts, were missed. But things only get worse. One EMS officer fitting Damien's electronic tag reported later that he'd said something chilling. If this relationship goes bad, I'll murder my girlfriend and her kids. However, this officer never passed that information on. There was no call. There was no email. Just silence. The staff in the probation service were either so overwhelmed or just so lax that these horrifying words didn't call for action. The probation teams in Swindon and Chesterfield were juggling hundreds of cases. One senior officer later testified that she herself was managing 350 people at once. It wasn't possible, she said, to do a deep dive on every one of those people. And so that is how Damien Bendel stayed under the radar, how this monster was deemed low risk. How he was somehow free to live in a home with a woman and 2 children, people who had no idea what he'd done, no idea what he'd said, who he was, nor what he may become. And by September, the cracks were no longer just bureaucratic, they were about to explode into the real world. Damien had now missed multiple appointments with his substance misuse worker, and he openly admitted to using mild substances and strong alcohol. However, his risk level wasn't reassessed. There was no intervention, there was no escalation of his case, and no alert to the fact that this man, now under curfew in a home with young children, was clearly spiralling. Probation staff described the workload as unmanageable. One probation worker said she was working at 170% capacity, which might help us to understand what happened next. Because despite being ordered to live at a house with 2 children, nobody contacted Terry Harris and nobody conducted safeguarding checks. There was no visit, there was no phone calls at Terry, and there was no confirmation by anyone that this placement was actually safe. A later inquiry would call this dangerous and entirely inappropriate, a missed opportunity to stop the chain of events before they happened. So, meanwhile, Terry went on with life as usual. She was just raising her kids, posting those sweet photos, and welcoming Connie for another night at the house. It was a home full of colour, family drawings on the fridge, school shoes lined by the door, tubs of sweeties half full from the weekend's fundraising. Things had moved pretty fast for the new couple. Terry fell pregnant, so the home was about to get even more hectic. And that's how it was, until early on Sunday morning. Then a phone call, not from that house, not from a neighbour, but from a relative of Damien Bendel, miles away in Dorset. The family member was worried. He'd called them to say that he'd hurt himself. Dorset police passed the information to Derbyshire. At 7:26 a.m, officers were dispatched to Chandos Crescent. At 7:39, they pulled up outside the house. And there, calmly waiting for them, stood Damien. He was standing outside the house when police arrived. He wore a zipped-up coat over a Chelsea football top. There was no panic, no rush, just a strange, eerie calm on his behalf. One officer approached, and Damien said softly, "I need the police and an ambulance, because I just killed 4 people." The officers looked at each other, still uncertain if he was serious or maybe just under the influence. They then noticed some red on his shirt. He told them that he was injured in the chest and stomach. They moved him round to the side of the house and asked him if there were any weapons inside. He told them no and then repeated, "I'm going back to prison again. I've murdered 4 people." The moment where the truth began to land is captured in full on the officers' body-worn cameras. In a moment, I'm going to play that full footage and you'll see just how calmly he says it, how matter-of-fact he is, and how the officers, obviously stunned, begin to realise what they're about to walk into. But before I do, just remember this. Inside that house were 4 bodies laying amongst pure mayhem. All of them had no idea what was coming. All of them went to bed the night before, expecting to wake up to a new day, expecting to go out and sell more sweets together. Inside, it was John Paul that the officers found first. He was in the bathroom where he'd been getting ready to shower. Then Terry on the floor of the main bedroom, Lacey on the bed, and Connie in a separate room. All 4 had suffered catastrophic injuries. A claw hammer had been used. Lacey had also been violated, both before and after she was moved upstairs. Evidence showed that she tried to fight, that she did suffer. Damien, of course, later told police that he didn't remember much, just that he'd used a hammer, and that he now knew he was going back to prison. When officers cuffed him, he didn't resist. He sat quietly on the curb outside. He was acting as if none of this had really happened. They read him his rights, took him to the station, leaving behind them, inside that house, the silence of what he'd done that stretched from room to room. Here is the available footage. No description really does it justice. It's not that long, but it's definitely worth watching.
Yeah, I don't know what happened.
Alright, come to me. Mate, have you got anything on you that you shouldn't have?
No, there's no weapons or nothing.
Right.
Do you just want to undo your coat? Have you armed yourself?
Yeah.
You have?
Have you stabbed yourself, mate?
I can see blood on your hands.
Yeah.
Anywhere else?
Just my chest, 4 inches in with a bread knife.
Can we have a look?
Yeah, and one on the stomach. I bled quite.
Right, do you want
to?
yeah.
Can we go down
No, just stay there.
I just don't want to be in front of everyone.
Alright, just go on the corner.
Just walking wounded at the minute.
Alright, stand here. Stay here.
Right,
So
we're told, I know what's going to happen to you now, mate.
Well, I know what's going to happen when you go to prison, obviously, again.
Why, what have you done? Have you done something to anyone else?
Yeah.
What have you done?
I've murdered 4 people.
After doing what he did in that house, Damien then took an Xbox from the home and sold it for cash. He then took that money and used it to buy substances.
Officers and staff have been working around the clock on this case, and I can now confirm that in the early hours of this morning, 31-year-old Damien Bendel from Kilamarsh was charged with 4 counts of murder. He will appear before magistrates in Derby this morning. My thoughts, and those of the whole constabulary, remain with the families of those involved. Specially trained officers continue to support the families at this incredibly sad and difficult time. The loss of Terry, John Paul, Lacey and Connie has deeply impacted the whole community of Kilamarsh and beyond. I would like to thank residents for their support that they have given to the investigation team over the past few days, and to remind the people of Kilamarsh that my officers and staff will continue to patrol the area, and you can approach them if you have any information you want to pass on. Thank you.
Following the arrest, when Damien appeared in court, he pleaded guilty to all charges, 4 counts of murder, 1 count of violations against Lacey. The families of the victims delivered their statements. Jason Bennett, father of John Paul and Lacey, said, "It's like my heart has been shattered into a billion pieces, never to be repaired." Connie's dad, Charles Gent, said, "I wake up every morning hoping this has all been a terrible nightmare, but it's not." Inquests into the event revealed a level of systemic failure that stunned everyone involved. Probation officials accepted 51 separate failings. The Chief Inspector of Probation called it unacceptable at every stage. The senior coroner said the tragedy was contributed to by acts or omissions from the very agency meant to protect the public. The curfew order placing Damien in the home was dangerous and entirely inappropriate. No safeguarding checks had been completed. Warnings simply weren't shared. Those obscene electronic tag comments, where he said exactly what he was going to do, were somehow not reported. And yes, staff were overworked and they were under-supported, but regardless of the reasons, None of that will change the outcome for Terry, John Paul, Lacey and Connie. That house on Chandos Crescent has since been demolished. In its place, a patch of landscaped grass now grows. It's been turfed over in line with the family's wishes. There is a cherry tree planted nearby with a small plaque in remembrance. But the memory of that weekend, the sleepover, the sweet stall, the pictures of smiling children, all of that does remain. But sadly, so does the pain. Damien Bendel received a whole life sentence. This is a rare sentence in the UK, which means he will never, ever be released. A 21-year-old mum named McKenzie Anderson opens her phone and types out a post. She doesn't know it yet, but her predictions would come true. On the surface, McKenzie had been trying to move forwards. She had a toddler to care for, a new boyfriend, and enjoyed a recent Christmas spent with her family. But beneath all of that was an escalating fear, and sadly, McKenzie's worst fear would soon become a reality. When Tyrone Thompson walked out of prison on March 9th, 2022, he was not supposed to go anywhere near McKenzie Anderson. He had just served time for assaulting her, for intimidating her, and for destroying her property. A fresh apprehended domestic violence order, or an AVO, was put in place. This explicitly banned him from contacting McKenzie, but that boundary didn't last even one day. As soon as the offender was released, court documents later stated he called McKenzie, he said that he was coming for her, and he loved her. That same day, McKenzie shared a post online, equal parts sarcastic and concerned. "I'm okay. My ex Tyrone just got out of jail for what he did to me, and is still being weird and harassing me. He couldn't last 24 hours. Still, when McKenzie broke up with her new partner just a few days later, Tyrone seized the opening. McKenzie answered one of his calls, and then by March the 19th, just 10 days after his release, Tyrone was back in her orbit. They started spending time together, they talked, drank and laughed. To outsiders, it might have looked like reconciliation, but McKenzie wasn't safe. She began sending messages to DV advocacy groups. She asked about security doors. She asked for help installing cameras. She told friends that she was scared and that Tyrone had been weird and obsessed. McKenzie had been strong before. She had left him. She had testified. She had spoken out. She once posted online, "How many more lives need to be lost for people to take DV seriously? The system well and truly failed you." This would be a horrifying case of foreshadowing. Tyrone Thompson knew how to worm his way back into McKenzie's life, and he had no fear of frankly being unhinged. On March the 19th, he changed his Facebook profile picture to a photo of McKenzie's young son, a child that wasn't even his. It was a move designed to provoke emotion, to remind McKenzie of the family life that they once imagined. It was an attempt to manipulate her, and it appears that it worked. Once McKenzie broke up with her boyfriend, over the next 6 days, Tyrone embedded himself back into her home and routine. But this wasn't a peaceful reunion, it was tense and disturbing. On March the 25th, they were drinking together with a friend in their Mayfield home, and that's when things escalated. Tyrone grabbed McKenzie's phone, and he texted her now ex-boyfriend saying, "I'm bigger than you, lol." McKenzie snapped, "Give me my phone back," and now she wanted him gone. Later that night, Tyrone grew emotional and clingy. He cried and told McKenzie that he loved her. He accused her of not appreciating him. This was all getting too much, so she sent a chilling text message to the other friend saying, "Don't leave me alone with him here, LOL." The lol tried to soften it, but she wasn't joking. At around 9:30 p.m, the other friend in the home convinced Tyrone to leave and took him out for a walk. This seemed like a good break in the tension, but McKenzie knew that more was coming. By 10:10 p.m, Tyrone had climbed a ladder to her second-floor unit. He let himself back in. He now picked up McKenzie's phone once again, this time to text her mother. He said, "I'm with her. She wants me to talk to you." When McKenzie woke and realised that he was back inside, she now called the police. The day had already been clearly spiralling. By the time McKenzie made her triple O call at 10:39 p.m, it seems that she tried everything else to get rid of him, but now she was out of her depth. She messaged a girlfriend earlier that night, and it read, "Tyrone came at me with a knife. He's still a freak." When McKenzie got through to the triple O operator, she said, "My ex-boyfriend's broken in. I've woken up to him in my house, like I have an AVO on him." She was breathless, panicked, and obviously terrified. And in the background of the call, Tyrone could be heard saying, "Hang up, McKenzie." But she didn't. Instead, she pushed back. She strongly said to him, "No, stay away from me, stay away from me." The police operator stayed on the line as McKenzie explained that Tyrone had now taken her keys, that he'd come at her with a sharp implement, that there were normally 2 sharp kitchen implements, but only one of them could now be found in the house. He might still have it, she warned. Despite everything, she tried to stay calm. She tried to track where he went. McKenzie texted her friend from earlier on, saying, "Tyrone's back." Little did anyone know this would be the last message she would ever send. The friend then ran back to the unit, and when he arrived at the front door, it wouldn't open. Something or someone was blocking it from the inside. He peered through a gap, and he saw McKenzie lying on the floor. Tyrone was standing over her. He was plunging at her with a sharp implement, not saying a word. A neighbour watching from a balcony saw McKenzie pressed against the window like she was trying desperately to escape. She heard Tyrone yelling, stab me again, you dog." But this wasn't a fight. It was more like an execution. Both of the sharp implements from the kitchen were being used, and one of them snapped from the force. McKenzie suffered 78 wounds in under 2 minutes. Her time on this earth came to an end, with the phone still in her hand. Police arrived at 10:53 p.m, just 14 minutes after her phone call, but by then it was far too late. Tyrone was already screaming, "Help me, she's dead, help me, she's dead." He did have a cut on his hand, and he claimed that McKenzie was the one that attacked him, and that he simply grabbed a sharp implement and then snapped. But his own words to police would betray him. He said, "I just stabbed, until she stopped." But somehow, things would get even more tragic. Even seasoned officers were shaken. When police arrived at McKenzie's Mayfield apartment, they found her toddler son standing nearby. Thankfully, he was unharmed, but he was covered in a red that had leaked from his mother. Superintendent Wayne Humphrey later described the footage from body-worn cameras as horrendous. 4 ambulances were dispatched. A specialist care team tried everything to bring her back, but McKenzie was already gone. Her body now lay just outside her unit. She had tried to escape. She had called for help, and she tried her best to survive. But in reality, she didn't stand a chance. A broken knife handle was found resting on her chest. She had deep markings to her face, neck, and body. It was clear that she fought to the end. Later, when Mother Tabitha visited the unit, it had already been cleaned, but she could still see everything. There was still a story of violence, she told the court. "I saw a path that led from the bedroom. You could tell she tried to escape." Her daughter's emails to advocacy groups were still open on her laptop. Messages asking for help with cameras, locks, and doors. Requests that were answered only after she was passed. One agency even sent a letter addressed to McKenzie saying her case was being closed, the reason being that she had now passed away. Mother Tabitha told the court her death was no surprise, a death in slow motion. Tyrone Thompson hadn't even faced McKenzie's family in person. He watched the sentencing over an audio-visual link from prison. He didn't speak, didn't apologise publicly, but the judge did read out a letter that he'd written. "No words can undo the pain. I never planned to hurt her that night. I would give anything to take that moment back." But McKenzie's mother didn't buy it. She told the court, "The night I received the phone call that my daughter had been murdered, it was as if the world spun around me. My soul fractured. No sentence, she said, would ever undo that. In the weeks before her end, McKenzie Anderson wasn't just scared, she was fighting. She had survived DV, she had beaten substance addiction, she fought mental health struggles, and was thriving as a single mother at age just 21. She had dreams, she had a smile that people described as sunshine, and she also had something important to say. Her social media was full of raw posts. She talked about recovery, saying, "I've been clean from ice for 3 years now. In fixing myself from being an addict is when I found out who I really was." She posted about parenting, how women were expected to do everything without praise, without breaks. And she posted about Tyrone. One caption read, "Highly embarrassing. I had a baby to someone like this." In a reply she added, "This is his friend group. Kill me." In another post she wrote, "I'm sick of losing my close friends to either substances or violence. This world has to change." McKenzie didn't know that she would become one of the names that people mourned. Justice Richard Weinstein called McKenzie's passing every parent's nightmare. He acknowledged the heartbreak of her family and the dark elements that Tyrone Thompson brought into her life. He described the attack as frenzied, as being so violent that one of the weapons broke from the force. He confirmed that McKenzie had tried to leave the relationship, but Tyrone just refused to let her go. The Crown argued that the prior behaviour, the breach of the AVO, and the deliberate entry into her home should elevate the severity of the sentence. But the judge also took into account Tyrone's mental health diagnosis, which included complex PTSD and a severe personality disorder, his terrible upbringing, and the maltreatment that he suffered at home, along with his time in isolation in Goulburn Prison, were all cited as mitigating factors. And because Tyrone pleaded guilty just days before his trial, he received a 10% sentencing discount, and that discount would become the final insult. To Mackenzie's family, it wasn't justice. This was policy over people. Her mother later wrote, "We are hoping for a sentence that reflects the crime, but history has not shown us that this is the case all the time." The sentence was handed down, 22 years and 6 months, eligible for parole in 2038. To Tabitha, it felt like confirmation that the system still didn't understand the danger that women like her daughter were facing. She had one word for the outcome: outraged. In a final tribute, her mother asked the public to remember her, not by the violence that she suffered, but by her spirit. Have a dance, sing out loud. For her, life was worthy of celebration, she said. But the advocacy wouldn't end with Mackenzie's life. Mother Tabitha launched They Are Our Daughters, a platform for DV awareness and legal reform. She called for ankle monitoring for repeat offenders, for stronger parole restrictions, for national education on coercive control. Because if we really want change, she said, we need to get to the root of the problem. She hopes her daughter's voice will echo on, even if it took her passing to finally make people listen. On the day of the sentencing, Mackenzie's family, including her mother, sat in the Newcastle Supreme Court waiting for justice. However, instead, they found that he would be eligible for parole in 15 years and 6 months. When those words were read aloud, the devastated mother ran sobbing from the courtroom. She collapsed on the ground outside. Later, she spoke through tears to reporters. "We are outraged by today's outcome. We are disgusted that this sentence is what they think the value of my daughter's life was worth." Her words were sharp and deliberate.
Her mother, Tabitha Ackroyd, managed to summon the strength to speak after collapsing just outside the Newcastle courtroom.
He had violently assaulted my daughter for 2 years. He should not have been out of jail. Mackenzie's legacy will be one of action, of justice and of hope, and I call for this sentence to be appealed. Her voice was taken from her, but mine will not be silenced.
Justice Weinstein's sentence was an insult to women globally. "I call for an urgent appeal of this sentence," she said. She blamed the system, not just Tyrone. She said that Mackenzie's death wasn't a shock. It was a result of repeated, documented failures. She said Mackenzie did everything she could to try and keep safe, but she was constantly failed by the system. McKenzie Anderson was far more than what was done to her. She was a mother, a daughter, a fighter. She saw the danger coming. She asked desperately for help, but in the end, she was forced to pay with her life. Just 16 days after Tyrone Thompson walked free, she was gone. So now McKenzie's story becomes a rallying cry, not just for justice, but for change. Her mother continues that fight, and every time we say her name, we remind the world what was taken and what happens every single day. Justice was delayed, justice was reduced, but McKenzie is not forgotten. The camera in Judge Kevin Mullins' chambers records in silence. We see a quiet room with heavy bookshelves, a wide desk, and two men who have known each other for decades. At 2:55 p.m, former Sheriff Sean Mickey Steins steps inside. He didn't slam the door. He didn't shout. He just walks in. The judge doesn't react because why would he? He was expecting something ordinary. A request, a question, maybe even a private word about the deposition from earlier that week. Instead, within seconds, all hell broke loose. In Letcher County, Kentucky, power wears a plain face. The county, tucked into the Appalachian Mountains, is the kind of place where everyone knows your name, your kids, your secrets. Sean Mickey Steins was part of the fabric of the community. He'd grown up in the hills and hollers of Neon, Kentucky. He served as a bailiff in the courthouse, then became sheriff in 2018, and was re-elected in 2022. He was the guy that you called when things went sideways. Judge Kevin Mullins had his own kind of legacy. Appointed in 2009, elected the next year, and known as much for his compassion as for his authority. He'd spent nearly a decade before that as a prosecutor, but once he became judge, he tried something different. People trusted Kevin, and they trusted Mickey, and the two men together were more than colleagues. They became good friends. They ate lunch together for years, often at the street-side grill, just a few hundred yards from the courthouse. Sometimes they sat with a group, sometimes just the two of them, and there was no hint that the relationship between the two men had any fractures at all. But somewhere in the weeks, and maybe years, leading up to September the 19th, something had shifted. When outsiders picture rural Kentucky justice, they often imagine something rough around the edges. But in Letcher County, the courthouse was a steady, familiar place. Judge Mullins presided over everything from small claims to felony arraignments, and then there was probate, traffic, and domestic cases. His courtroom was orderly and calm, and Mickey Steins, before his time as sheriff, stood just a few feet away from that bench, and day after day he worked as Mullins' bailiff. Their close dynamic was shaped by years of routine. Steins didn't just enforce the law, he stood behind it and stood beside it. And Mullins didn't just hand down rulings, he lived among the people that his decisions affected. In a county with only 2,000 residents in its seat, these weren't just officials, they were neighbours. They were friends, and sometimes they were godparents. Mullins was known for his leniency towards those fighting addiction. He focused on treatment for addicts over punishments. He was known for allowing some defendants with substance issues to enter rehab programs as a condition for their release. And his diversion programs, whilst controversial to some, earned him admiration from local advocates. Steins, on the other hand, had built his reputation on order and accountability. Still, their differences in style didn't breed animosity, at least not outwardly. They shared too much history, and even after Steins became sheriff, the two did remain close. They shared text messages, they attended community events, and there were never any fireworks. There were no reports of arguments. There weren't even whispers of a scandal between the two. Until, that is, something came crashing into court filings a few weeks later. Because, buried beneath the quiet routine of courthouse life, were darker accusations. And with that, a lawsuit that would put both men's reputations under a microscope. 3 days before the events of this video, Mickey Steins sat for a deposition. It was part of a federal lawsuit filed in 2022 by two women who said they were exploited by a former deputy, a man named Ben Fields. The allegations were horrific. Fields had been accused of coercing female inmates into intimate physical acts. One woman claimed those encounters actually happened in Judge Mullins' chambers, and she also said that she wasn't the only one. In court filings and news interviews, she alleged that the judge was aware, or maybe even worse. There was even mention of surveillance recordings, although this hasn't been confirmed publicly. Steins, though not a direct defendant in this case, had been pulled in for deposition over his role as sheriff and his oversight, or alleged lack of it. According to records, the questioning got personal. Steins was forced to discuss his former deputy, to talk about his own decisions and the environment at the jail that he ran. And more than that, he reportedly learned during the deposition that Mullins' phone had placed calls to his daughter in the past. Calls that she hadn't mentioned. Steins left that deposition shaken and confused. His attorney would later claim that what followed was a rapid unraveling of his mental state. They said he stopped sleeping. He became deeply paranoid. He told friends and family that he feared for his safety and for theirs. The day before the event, loved ones reportedly took him to a medical provider. But what exactly was said there has not been released. But what's pretty clear is this. By the morning of September the 19th, the lines between reality and pure fear had been blurred for Steins. And that morning started like any other in Whitesburg. There were clear skies, quiet streets, a routine courthouse docket. Judge Mullins and Sheriff Steins were both in attendance, and neither man seemed on edge. In fact, by lunchtime they were seated outside at the Streetside Grill and Bar, alongside a few others. They ordered the usual. Both had the wings and salad combo, $13.99. They laughed, they talked. There were no raised voices and no visible tension. But at some point during that meal, a question was overheard. Witnesses later recalled hearing Mullins say to Steins, "Do we need to meet private in my chambers?" It didn't sound angry. If anything, it sounded procedural. But taken in hindsight, it had a much deeper and darker meaning. Back inside the courthouse later that afternoon, Steins was seen trying to call his daughter, first from his own phone, then, after asking Mullins for it, from the judge's phone as well. The judge handed his phone over without hesitation. Steins' daughter's phone number was stored in Mullins' phone. The implications of that aren't fully known. Investigators have not said what Steins may have seen, but whatever it was, moments after looking at that phone, Mickey Steins stood up. He walked towards the door of Mullins' chambers, and he closed it behind him. What followed happened in an eerily calm and quick manner. At least that's how it looks on surveillance video. But what happened in that room would change everything. There's no audio on the security footage from inside the judge's chambers. Judge Kevin Mullins behind his desk, Sheriff Steins in front of it. We see a brief exchange. Nothing appears rushed or angry or out of control. Then, in a matter of seconds, it turns. Mullins moves to duck behind his desk. Steins pulls out a weapon. He raises it, pulls the trigger, and the judge slumps to the floor. He's still partially hidden behind a large desk that had once symbolized his authority. But this ordeal wasn't over yet. Steins stepped forward towards the judge's fallen form, and he fired again, in total 8 times. Then, just like that, he walks out. Outside the chambers, officers and staff freeze. It's unclear just how much of what happened in that office was heard. The building is old, its walls are thick, and the door was closed. But within moments, word spreads. A 911 call is placed from inside the courthouse. Shots fired, judge down. When officers arrive, they find Steins waiting. He doesn't run or resist, he's pretty calm. And according to Detective Clayton Stamper of the Kentucky State Police, he says just one thing: treat me fair. Another officer claims that Steins said something else entirely. They're trying to kidnap my wife and kid. Steins is immediately taken into custody, and in that moment, everything small-town Kentucky thought it knew about these two men was shattered. The public has only seen 20 seconds of the surveillance footage, but prosecutors and defense attorneys have seen more. Defense attorneys say it's evidence of a man that had been pushed beyond his breaking point, a man triggered by what he saw on Mullin's phone. Prosecution hasn't released any details of what was seen on that phone screen, if anything. Detective Stamper, though, confirmed that the daughter's number was indeed stored in Mullin's contacts, but he didn't give an exact reason as to why. When the detective was asked if the shooting was connected to the phone, he answered carefully, saying, "It could be, but I don't know that for a fact." Mickey Steins has pleaded not guilty to what he did on video in that office. His defense is clear and simple: insanity and extreme emotional disturbance. In filings, his attorneys argue that he was suffering from a serious mental health crisis. They say that following his deposition in a civil case, where he was forced to revisit disturbing allegations involving his former deputy, he became consumed by paranoia. He told multiple people that others were out to hurt his family and that he hadn't slept for days. And as we know, his loved ones were so alarmed by all of this that they staged what amounted to an intervention just one day before this event. However, that visit to the medical provider wasn't enough to stop what was already building inside him. And when his daughter's phone number appeared on Mullin's screen, when Steins saw that connection in his head, whether it was real or imagined, his world imploded. In court, defense attorney Jeremy Bartley told the judge, ultimately, he was in fear for the safety of his wife and daughter, and I think what you see there is the result of that. Prosecutors, however, that it was murder, plain and simple, that a man walked into a room, that he shot a public official, and then finished the job. They believe that the video speaks for itself. Stein's mental health may be a factor, but according to them, it's not enough to absolve him of responsibility. A special prosecutor and retired judge are overseeing the case due to the close community ties. And in Letcher County, where friends often become colleagues and secrets rarely stay buried, the community is just waiting for those answers. But honestly, there's a high possibility that this will all be buried deep. What really happened between those two men? Had it been building for years upon years? Beneath the friendship, beneath the silence, beneath the smiles? And what did Steins truly believe he was protecting, and who was he protecting them from? Those questions may be answered when the trial concludes, but until then, everything remains alleged. Forensic analysis of the devices is still underway. The full truth, as of now, remains locked inside unanswered calls and unexplained fears, and it is possible that we may never know. However, the camera doesn't lie, and I'll update this case once the court reaches a verdict. Jamie Aaron Lavis was born on the 16th of March 1989. The fact that Jamie was born a healthy little boy was just short of a miracle. Jamie was in fact one of twins, but sadly his brother was lost in utero. He was in many ways a typical young lad, described by his mother as being cheeky, funny, and as making everyone happy. He was well known and liked in the local community, and he enjoyed spending time outside with his older brother, John. The Lavis family are from the suburb of Openshaw in Greater Manchester. It is a working class area near the centre of the city. While at the time the suburb was considered a little rough, it was common for children to be playing out in the streets most days. Jamie was known for being mischievous, playful and boisterous, and in an interview with a local news station, his mother, Karen, recounted how he would have breakfast with his father, John, at 6 a.m. after the hard-working man had gotten in from his night shift, and then go on to win a second helping. He'd simply tell her that he hadn't eaten yet. She lovingly called him comical, a proper character. His sister described him as cute and sweet, with a smile that melted people's hearts. Jamie was one of 5 children, and despite his endless energy, he never strayed too far. For instance, as he was afraid of the dark, he was always home by tea time. However, on May the 5th, 1997, which was a national bank holiday, Jamie strangely failed to return home for tea. It was a particularly grey and wet day, and his mother was immediately alarmed. She knew that her boy would never come home late, and he loved his food. Jamie's father arrived home a few hours later, and he was initially reluctant to panic. He tried to keep his wife calm, claiming she was being overly sensitive, but by the time 9 p.m. and then 10 p.m. rolled around, the whole family knew that something was very, very wrong. They all went out looking for him. They felt especially concerned because Jamie was pretty small. Although he was 8 years old at the time, his clothing size was aged 5 to 6 and he was only 4 foot tall. Remember, he was one of twins. His family worried that he was too small to defend himself against other kids, let alone anyone bigger. The Lavis family searched for hours, but Jamie was nowhere to be found. The seeds of concern grew quickly into a huge, dark, imposing fear. So eventually, they called the police. And so unfolded one of the more disturbing cases in Manchester's long history. Neighbourhood search parties took to the streets, and very soon local news shows were involved. The Lavis family begged for Jamie's safe return.
If anybody out there knows where Jamie is or is giving him food, please just get in touch with the police. Everybody's waiting for him to come home.
Now, Jamie's described as being small for his age. He's about 4 foot tall, and he wears clothes that are made to fit a 5 to 6 year old.
Multiple tips and sightings started flooding in. Several people said they had seen Jamie catching the 219 bus that morning. He was apparently off to town to buy his mother a birthday present. Superintendent Roy Rainford, now retired, was the senior investigator on Jamie's case. He described the 219 bus route as one that Jamie often took, jumping aboard as he got up to his many little adventures. This made the Openshaw buses the first hotspot of the investigation. The particular bus route stopped near several derelict houses that children used to play in. This concerned Rainford because it meant there were many abandoned buildings to search through, and that there were ample empty spaces to hide something nefarious. CCTV footage showed that Jamie had in fact entered the bus station at around 10:30 a.m. that morning, but this was the last footage that they could find. It was almost as if from the bus station, Jamie vanished into thin air. The hours rolled on. The investigation seemed to be leading nowhere. The Lavis family were becoming more and more distraught, until a glimmer of hope. Around 24 hours after Jamie's disappearance, a local bus driver approached the family. He informed them that Jamie had been on his bus the day that he went missing. He even confirmed that Jamie was wearing a dark blue Reebok tracksuit. And, grateful for the first lead of the case, the family felt that this man could be the key to bringing Jamie home. Darren Vickers, a 28-year-old bus driver, was the last person to see Jamie before he vanished in May of 1997. Darren only lived a few houses down from the Lavis family, and he told the police that Jamie had spent all day on his bus the day that he went missing. He also said that Jamie had purchased a day saver ticket, a ticket that gives you unlimited travel within a certain area, and that he eventually got off at the Ashton bus station near their home. The family were frantic and desperate for answers, and Darren was the closest tie they had to their missing son. Soon, Darren began integrating himself into the family's lives, spending days on end in their home to help with the investigation. He claimed that he felt guilty, having been the last point of contact with Jamie. He felt that he had a responsibility to the family and to Jamie, so the Lavis family embraced him as a good Samaritan, as someone who was both willing and able to help them when they needed it the most. Darren also started to talk to the media. He gave several interviews with local news stations. He stated that whoever was keeping a boy of that age was sick, and that they needed to send him home. He also told the media that, unlike the police, he did not believe that Jamie was no longer alive.
There's somebody out there who's got to be sick keeping a child of that age. You know, it shouldn't be done. If you had any respect, you just hand him over to the nearest police station, just let the child go in, just let him come home. He's not in trouble, he's not nothing, he's just wanted. I feel he's still alive. I don't fear the same way the police fear that he's murdered. His family don't. But somebody somewhere knows where Jamie is. Could never dream of it. A young child on the bus like that, you know, and just going missing. It's just unbearable to think about. It's just a nightmare for everyone. We just got close. It's like one big close family now because we've been out virtually 24 hours a day, all of us involved looking for Jamie.
He even took part in a police reconstruction of the day that Jamie went missing. Darren now acted as the unofficial spokesperson when the family couldn't face the media. One officer even described him, ominously, as their kingpin. He began thinking of himself as their pillar of strength. He would lead search parties looking for the boy. The family soon became emotionally dependent on Darren. The more he placed himself at the centre of the case, the more unnerved people around the family became. Community members found his new fixation odd, and soon the police became suspicious as well. It also became increasingly difficult for the police to share information and updates with the family, that is, without it quickly filtering through to Darren. Some officers felt that the Lavis family trusted Darren more than they trusted the police, and who could blame them? Darren had moved in with the family even though he had his own family just a few doors down. Despite the police's frustrations and their suspicions, they had no evidence or strong leads, and the case seemed to reach a deadlock. However, slowly, witness accounts of Jamie's last day started trickling in from people on the bus, and all of them varied starkly from Darren's story. He had described Jamie as just another passenger on the bus. However, several other eyewitness accounts said that this was simply not true. Jamie was described as having turned the bus into a playground. He was collecting tickets and changing the gears of the bus. Police also noted that a lone child couldn't purchase a day-saver ticket, and due to these mounting holes in the story, Darren now became the prime suspect. Investigators started pouring through hours of CCTV footage, and it was then they discovered something unsettling. While it was true that Jamie arrived at the bus station that morning at around 10:30 a.m, he didn't simply get on a bus. Rather, Jamie was approached by a man who can be seen ruffling his hair. And that man in the footage was Darren Vickers. The police immediately ran a background check on Darren. They discovered at the time of Jamie's disappearance, he had only been working as a bus driver for a few days. On his CV, most of his references were simply fake, and he'd made them up, except for one. And that one person was a convicted pedophile. With their new discoveries backing their investigation, the police were able to arrest Darren Vickers on the 24th of May 1997. This was approximately 3 weeks from Jamie's disappearance. Shockingly, the Lavis family were appalled by the arrest. They blamed the police as being desperate and having no other leads. They still felt that Darren was their friend, and maybe more than that. To them, he had been their hero throughout this emotional trauma. And perhaps Jamie's family did actually have a point. The evidence against Darren was in reality pretty weak, and so police were unable to charge him. Darren was released. He was welcomed home and fully embraced once again by the Lavis family. Not only were they waiting for him at the station when he was released, but they even threw him a party. Backed by the family's strong support, Darren's confidence escalated. He now even called into a local Manchester radio station to discuss the case. And again, he stated that he believed Jamie was still alive, and that if he weren't, they would have found his body by now.
Well, I was coming back from Manchester, and I said to him that I'm going to have to drop you back off now because this is my last run up. Jamie turned around and said to me, but my mum and dad's not in, I've got nowhere to go. Then I said to him, well, since you only live around the corner from me, I can take you back to the depot and drop you off when I go home. He was over the moon about it. He said, yeah. I said, are you sure you're going to be okay? He said, yeah. That was the last we saw of him.
So how's the police investigation going, Darren?
The police are not letting much information out about that. Which the family is supposed to know, the first confirmed sighting. Yeah. We've never been told. I'll never know till the day he comes home. I still believe he's alive. If the case was what the police are making out to be, if the case was he was dead, around where they're looking, they'd have found him by now.
Darren's behaviour was starting to rouse suspicion from those close to the case, but still seemingly not with Karen or John. Darren then shockingly invited a camera crew into the Lavis family's home. This was all an attempt to clear his name. In the clips, he can be seen explicitly stating, "I've got nothing to do with the abduction of James Lavis. I've got the backing of the Lavis family, relations, everybody." And so the investigation rolled frustratingly on.
I've got nothing to do with the abduction of James Lavis. And I've got the backing of the Lavis family, relations, everybody.
In a stroke of luck, a few months later, Darren Vickers was arrested for outstanding driving offences and kept in prison for 10 weeks. This finally gave the police time to focus on the investigation without Darren's interference. Jamie's family can now be spoken to by the police in peace. Perhaps this distance would generate some new information, and it did. Before his arrest, Darren would take Jamie's older brother, John Jr., on day trips on several bus routes. Since John Jr. and Jamie were similar sizes and close in age, police came to believe that Darren was trying to elicit false sightings, confusing the case even further and putting distance between himself and Jamie. Darren had also used a scanner to track police reports. He would show up at possible sightings with Jamie's mother. This behaviour was disruptive, to say the least. Most importantly at this time, with Darren in jail, the police could access the Lavis family free from Darren's manipulative hold. At this time, the Lavis family started to reconsider their relationship with Darren, and by October, the police finally had enough circumstantial evidence, along with the family's new backing, to arrest and charge Darren Vickers with the abduction of Jamie Lavis. Still though, investigators were determined to charge Darren with murder as well. Even though he was already under arrest, they continued a frantic search for Jamie's body. It was now that they received several tips that Darren had been to a particular part of a park called Reddish Vale. And shockingly, not only had Darren been to the park, but according to Sergeant Rainford, he had brought several children to the park at midnight. These children recognised Darren from the media appearances that he had placed himself in, and they then went to the police. The children said that Darren showed them a picture of Jamie. He then pointed whilst claiming to see him. This understandably scared the children, and they ran away, frightened. It was also reported that Darren brought Jamie's older brother John Jr. to the same spot in the park. He then gave him a cigarette and told him, "This is where your Jamie is, and if you don't behave yourself, I'll throw you in." Finally, near to where Darren had brought the children and Jamie's own brother, situated in a dense and overgrown part of the park, just off of the footpath, police found an item of children's clothing. It was the tracksuit bottoms that Jamie had been wearing on the day that he went missing. Investigators took the clothing for forensic testing and, carefully wrapped inside an item of clothing, they found a small jawbone. Other bones were found scattered around the park. DNA testing of milk teeth proved that the remains did belong to Jamie Lavis. Darren was now charged with abduction and murder. Police believe that after his shift, Darren lured Jamie into his car. He then violated him and ended his short time on this earth. Darren pled not guilty. During the trial, he claimed that Jamie's father was in fact the murderer, and that he himself was having an affair with Jamie's mother Karen, and that she was carrying his child. Karen was indeed pregnant at the time. She was forced to take a blood test to prove that the baby was not fathered by Darren. Darren's defense was, it turns out, totally fabricated. He was unanimously found guilty. Darren Vickers was charged to life in prison with a minimum term of 25 years. But even still, his vile manipulation and fascination with the media knew no bounds. He now confessed to the murder and violation of Jamie Lavis. However, he then contacted the media just a few days later and publicly retracted his confession. Several officers that worked on the case believed that Darren Vickers would have gone on to become a serial killer were he not imprisoned. Darren was up for parole in 2023, but he was thankfully refused. Tragically, Jamie's older brother, John Jr., ended his own time on this earth at age 31. The Lavis family think of Jamie every day, and Mother Karen still writes poems about her son to this very day.